service in Members' Library between 11:30 a.m. and 3:30 p.m. Members will cast their votes by placing the completed division slip in one of the ballot boxes provided. I remind colleagues of the importance of social distancing during the deferred division and ask them to pick up a division slip from the vote office and fill it in before they reach the library if possible. The result will be announced in the chamber as soon as possible after the division is over. We now come to questions to the Minister for Women and Equalities. Number one, Debbie Abrahams. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I'd like to answer question 1 and 2 together. The Government is committed to supporting disabled people affected by the Covid-19 outbreak. We continue to monitor the impact of Covid-19 on disabled people using existing and new data sources.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Speaker, between March and July, disabled people, which include people with a health condition or an impairment, accounted for almost 60% of all COVID deaths. Yet a survey of disabled people in Greater Manchester revealed that 8 out of 10 weren't included in the official government shielded group, in spite of 57% having significant support needs. Mr. Speaker, with the second wave upon us, what is the Secretary of State doing to ensure that all clinically vulnerable people are shielded and properly supported?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that is a really important point to raise. And through my work as the Minister for Disabled People, in conjunction with the Disability Unit that I'm responsible for, where stakeholders identify challenges, we raise that with the relevant minister around support for those who were shielding. Obviously, shielding has come to an end. That has continued to be kept under review and make sure that people feel safe, particularly those who are seeking to work. We expect employers to act in accordance with the Equality Act and working with BEIS, HSC and ACAS, publishing helpful guidance to make sure that there is sufficient support for those who are coming out of shielding and returning to normality.
2 withdrawn, so we go to Caroline Rose.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The charity Sign Health has been working to provide BSL translation for COVID sufferers in health settings free of charge since the pandemic began. They've submitted a grant application to the Department of Health and Social Care, but so far that has not been awarded to them. Please will my honourable friend use his best endeavours with colleagues at Health to get this apparent blockage shifted. As we seek to avoid a second wave of the virus, we also have to make sure that deaf people reliant on BSL as their main form of communication are not being disadvantaged in their access to information.
Mr. Speaker, I know through my honourable friend's work as the chair of the Women and Equality Select Committee, there is no stronger advocate for accessible communications, and this is something that stakeholders rightly raise time and time again. And again, through the Disability Unit, we've reminded all government departments of the importance of this. It sounds to me like this organisation has provided a wonderful service. I know DHSC value good services, and I will encourage the relevant minister to look at this personally and respond as quickly as possible.
We now come to Anne McLaughlin, the SNP spokesperson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Before I ask my question, if I may, I'd like to pay tribute to the many people out there with disabilities who've been helping others during the pandemic. It's important to keep saying that having a disability does not stop you contributing. For many, however, their disability prevents them from having a job and they're dependent on social security payments. And those payments, sometimes you have to jump through hoops to prove that you are disabled enough to deserve them. Right now, face-to-face work capability assessments are on hold, understandably, but the wait is causing untold stress. So will he represent the needs of those people to the Work and Pensions Secretary and join me in calling for paper-based assessments to be made available to everyone?
I think you'll remember a really good question. First of all, absolutely right about wanting to be able to contribute. You ask any disabled person, they want to have the same opportunities that anyone else would take for granted. Rightly, we had to suspend face-to-face assessments. We have, where possible, been used paper-based reviews, and we're bringing telephone assessments into WCA in the same way that we've done with PIP. Again, warmly welcomed by stakeholders. But in the long term, as part of the Green Paper in the coming months, we'll be exploring better ways to reform the assessment and increase the likelihood of being able to do paper-based reviews wherever possible, predominantly where we're able to get better quality medical evidence.
Good to you.
Thank you. We know that number 4, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We continue to fund numerous programmes. Pardon me, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I'll take questions 5 and 6, 4 and 6 together. Thank you. We continue to fund numerous programs to increase girls' and young women's take-up of STEM subjects. The number of girls' STEM A-level entries has increased year on year, despite an overall reduction in cohort size. Since 2010, there has been a 31% increase in girls' entries to STEM A-levels in England and a 34% increase in women accepted onto full-time STEM undergraduate courses in the UK.
Continue.
Thank you very much. We know that the new core maths course is highly regarded both for its accessibility and its pragmatism, and therefore it can play a huge part in increasing participation in maths. Would the Minister be able to tell me how we are engaging with female pupils in particular to encourage them to take up this fantastic course?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. Our Advanced Maths Support Programme, worth £8 million per year, includes aims to increase the number of girls studying Level 3 Maths, which includes core maths. Out of over 17,000 students participating in the programme's events last year, 55% of attendees were female. We'll be using research such as our behavioural insight studies to inform future work on how to get more girls studying maths after GCSE.
5 withdrawn, so we go to Jet Leplasty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituency is a world-renowned centre of aerospace and defence expertise. So how can the government help encourage more women to take up these subjects, in apprenticeships in particular, so we can equip the country and them with the skills we'll need for the future?
Mr. Speaker, along with these significant measures I've already mentioned on increasing the take-up of STEM subjects amongst girls and women, we're also raising awareness of STEM careers through programmes such as STEM Ambassadors, 45% of whom are women. DFE is also taking steps to engage with the sector through apprenticeships. But on aerospace specifically, we're supporting industry's efforts to increase diversity in the sector through the Women in Aviation and Aerospace Charter, recognising that a more diverse sector is good for business, customers and workplace culture.
We have a substantive question to Minister Baden. Substantive question from Janet Davey.
Supplementary.
Is it supplementary?
Yeah,
I do apologise. We now go to Lewisham with Janet Davey. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the UK, female employment in the technology industry stands at 16.7% and grew less than 1% in the last 10 years. This is one of the most promising and booming industries, but it is one that women hardly find themselves in. What discussion has her department had with her cabinet colleagues to provide incentives for technology businesses to employ women?
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Lady for that question. The government takes this issue very seriously. I know that the Equalities Department carries out various studies in order to encourage women into this sector. We know that there are disparities in gender representation in some sector subject areas. Women still account for 6% and 8% of starts in construction planning and built environment and engineering technologies. This is a space in which we're working very hard and we continue to consult with business, and I know that my cabinet colleagues are also working on this issue.
Pauline.
Number 8, sir. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll take questions 8 and 9 together. We're determined to tackle geographic inequality and level up our country. The Equality Hub will look at the data to identify the real barriers that are holding people back.
Pauline.
Does she agree that the geographical inequality has been a neglected strand of the equality agenda, not inequality?
Well, I very much agree with my honourable friend. Often the differences in wages or employment are greater between regions of the UK than are in other types of inequality. See, for example, there's a 28% gap in weekly pay between the North East and London.
Steve Dobbs.
And can I thank my honourable friend for that answer? She'll be aware that people in Cornwall have faced a disadvantage of opportunity for far too long because of our geography. So will she ensure that in amongst all of the loud political noise at this time, that levelling up geographical inequalities will remain at the heart of this government's agenda?
Well, I agree. It's vital we level up across the country and make sure that your postcode doesn't dictate your life chances. As I saw when visiting Cornwall's growing lithium mining industry last week, there are real opportunities to level up and help Cornwall grow economically and benefit all of the people of that great county.
Question number 10, sir.
Mr. Speaker, the government has taken a number of steps to protect all those who may be disproportionately affected by COVID-19 in order to reduce the spread of the virus. This includes targeted testing of occupations and groups at higher risk, including ethnic minority women. We have also translated the latest information into multiple languages and accessible formats to help ensure our public health communications reach all communities across the country.
Teresa Villiers.
Women from black and minority ethnic backgrounds are strongly represented in the workforce in our care system. So can I ask the Minister to have a strong focus on keeping care workers safe from COVID, with a particular emphasis on the higher risk faced by women from black and minority ethnic communities in those jobs?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right. There are very many BME workers in the social care sector and they must be properly supported. And that's why in June, the Department of Health published a COVID-19 adult social care workforce risk reduction framework to help manage specific risks to staff, including risk by ethnicity. We're also providing financial support to the Race Equality Foundation to provide additional services to BME communities with dementia during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Number 11, please, sir.
Trade and enterprise are vitally important to women across the world to help them take control of their own lives. That's why we're backing programmes like She Trades and Female Founders to support women across the Commonwealth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend for her answer. I have many South Derbyshire residents who have concerns about improving the lives of women in developing countries. They write to me often about this. Can she tell us how women in developing countries will benefit from the trade policies from our government?
Well, on Sunday, I was pleased to speak at an UNGA event on investing in Africa's female future. Nimco Ali's 5 Foundation were also represented. They're doing great work to tackle female genital mutilation and bring more economic opportunities for women. And in the Trade Department, we're currently working on trade continuity agreements with countries like Kenya to help build trade and help women in those countries succeed.
Number 12, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There has been a worrying rise in the amount of abuse, harassment and intimidation online, and women are often disproportionately targeted by such abuse. It's completely unacceptable and in fact impacts individuals' rights to participate online. We've set out robust measures to deal with this in the Online Harms White Paper, and we'll be publishing a full government response to this later on in the year.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad the Minister recognises this point. Almost 1 in 2 women report experiencing online abuse since the start of COVID-19. However, the government has delayed the draft of the Online Harms Bill until it's, I understand, the end of 2021. This legislation is clearly needed now. So when will the government bring the bill forward?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm afraid the honourable gentleman is misinformed. We are absolutely committed to making the UK the safest place to go online. The Online Harms White Paper will set out how we're going to make world-leading legislation. We intend to publish that before the end of the year, and the legislation to follow at the very beginning of next year.
We now come to the substantive question to Secretary Truss from Dan Carden. Secretary Truss.
We want to make sure everyone in the UK is free to live their lives and fulfil their potential, regardless of their sex, gender identity or sexual orientation. We'll soon be hosting the government's first ever international LGBT conference to advance LGBT rights across the world.
We now go to Liverpool Walton with Dan Carden. Dan Carden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After an organisation in Anfield in my constituency was exposed for offering cures to homosexuality involving rituals and starvation, the government gave me a commitment in this House that it would ban these so-called conversion therapies. Now, that was back in 2018, and there is real concern this new government is backtracking on LGBT rights. So when will the government bring forward a ban on these harmful practices, as promised at its own LGBT action plan? And following her response yesterday on changes to the Gender Recognition Act that fell well short of what's needed to secure the rights of trans people in the UK? Will she make a full statement in the chamber to allow proper debate on it? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary Truss.
Well, conversion therapy is a completely abhorrent practice. We are working to end it. We're currently conducting research, and I will be coming back shortly to talk about the future and how we do end it, but it's important that research is conducted. As I made clear in my written statement yesterday, it's very important we protect transgender rights, but also improve transgender healthcare. That's what we're doing by opening more clinics and also making the process of GRC kinder and more straightforward.
We have a substantive question to Minister Bain now.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to make clear caste is not a protected characteristic in the Equality Act 2010. Case law has shown that a claim of caste discrimination may already qualify for protection under the race provisions in the Act. We therefore intend to repeal the uncommenced duty in the Act to make caste an explicit aspect of race discrimination as soon as practicable.
Bob Blackman landing his question. Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome my honourable friend to her place in answering my regular questions on this particular topic. The fact is, we've had a large-scale consultation of the community. We've had a written ministerial statement making clear that we are going to abolish and remove this protected characteristic from the Equality Act. So I would urge my honourable friend to bring forward without delay proposals to remove this unnecessary, ill thought out and divisive move in the Equality Act 2010.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. We do agree with him. The government completely opposes any discrimination because of a person's origins, including any perception of their caste, and we do remain committed to repealing the duty as soon as the opportunity arises.
Question 15, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Tomlinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. SSP is increased annually through uprating, which does not require an equality impact assessment. Individuals requiring further financial support may receive it through the welfare system.
Olivia Blake.
Research by my union, the GMB, has shown that a failure to raise statutory sick pay to livable rates has had serious detrimental effects on particular groups in our society. The status quo is disproportionately harming women workers, older workers, disabled workers, black and minority ethnic workers, workers who hold particular religious beliefs, and workers who are married or in a civil partnership. Does the Minister agree that the government should do an inequality impact assessment of these policies and do more to ensure that statutory sick pay is set at a livable rate?
Minister.
I thank the honourable member. Well, equality impact assessments are taken when there are policy changes, not part of the annual uprating exercise. That said, statutory sick pay shouldn't be looked in isolation because individuals subject to their own circumstances could access additional support either from their employer, Universal Credit or New Style ESA. We have recently concluded the consultation Our Health is Everyone's Business, where many of these issues were raised, and we will be publishing our reviews. We understand the points that the honourable member has raised.
Philippa Whitford.
Question 16, Mr. Speaker.
Tomlinson.
Our priority has been to continue delivering the state pension and pension credit to new and existing customers. We also supported those in the shielded group who would normally have had to rely on cash through the post office to cover their weekly outgoings.
Doctor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We know that elderly and disabled people, especially those living alone, are less likely to access online platforms. During this COVID pandemic, knowing the rules and understanding the ideas and information behind them is critical. So will this UK government be re-establishing regular briefings, including BSL translation, as we have in Scotland, so that no one misses out on vital information?
Minister.
The honourable member is absolutely right to highlight the importance of accessible communications. It was an issue raised particularly in the early stages that we then shared cross-government. I'm delighted that BSL, for example, was then picked up by the BBC, and that is then provided. Yesterday, the Prime Minister's statement was also simultaneously by the House, had a BSL interpreter, a very valid point to raise.
Jimmy Stone.
Nomination, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Dinage.
Appropriately, a question on sport, Mr. Speaker, as I sprint to the box. Mr. Speaker, we remain committed to supporting our young, female and disabled Olympic and Paralympic athletes through this very difficult period. We continue to work with UK Sport to ensure that athletes are assisted and supported in their preparation for the Tokyo Games and beyond to Paris 2024.
I wonder if the Minister agrees that this kind of investment will establish role models which will encourage people to get active in their own communities.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the Honourable Gentleman to his new role as the spokesperson on DCMS, and indeed as a very appropriate day, as today is National Fitness Day. He's absolutely right. If you can see it, you can be it. We want to inspire the next generation of young people to get physically fit, active, not only for their own health, physical health, but also for the mental health and well-being that it brings.
Secretary Trust, Topital 1.
Mr. Speaker, I want transgender people to be free to live and prosper in modern Britain. We will maintain the Gender Recognition Act, protect single-sex spaces and work to make the recognition process kinder and more straightforward. In line with the priorities of transgender people, we're improving health services and reducing waiting times, and we've also launched the CAS review to ensure that under 18s are getting the right support.
We now head to Rutland Melton with Alicia Kearns. Alicia Kearns.
Thank you and good morning, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, as well as the Health Secretary and the Prime Minister, for giving backing to my campaign to end the abhorrent practice of LGBT so-called conversion therapy. So can my right honourable friend kindly update the House on when she hopes to bring forward this vital legislation?
Secretary Truss.
Well, I congratulate my honourable friend on her leadership on this issue and also her work to support women when they are giving birth. Conversion therapy is an abhorrent practice, and we are currently conducting research, which I hope will be finished by the end of this month, on how to end it in the United Kingdom. And we will shortly after that be setting out steps to do that.
We're now heading to Shadow Minister Marsha Cordova to Battersea. Marsha.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After nearly 3 years, yesterday the government finally published its response to reforming the Gender Recognition Act, and disgracefully they have let the trans community down. Though the written statement included that the government are opening at least 3 new gender clinics this year. So can the Minister clarify whether the 3 clinics mentioned refer to the pilot services committed to by the previous government in 2018, or whether they represent a new investment by this government to improve trans healthcare?
Secretary Truss.
Well, in line with the priorities of the transgender community, we are seeking to reduce waiting lists in the health service by 1,600 people, as well as improving access to services with 3 new gender identity clinics. We also want to make sure proper training is available to general practitioners to get better services on the front line.
Heading back to Marsha with the second question. Marsha Cordova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I didn't get an answer to my first question, but I'll try this question. The average wait time for NHS gender services is 18 months, yet the NHS Constitution says that the first appointment should be within 18 weeks. Now, the government have rightly committed to reducing waiting lists by 1,600 people by 2022, but this still leaves an estimated 10,000 trans people on the list. So can the Minister set out what steps the government is going to take to bring these waiting lists down to ensure that trans people can access healthcare within the time set out in the legal framework?
Secretary Truss.
Well, the Honourable Lady is right that it is a priority to bring down waiting lists and make sure transgender people are getting the healthcare they deserve. That's why the GEO has put extra funding to support Dr. Michael Brady as our LGBT health advisor, and we're working very closely with the Health Secretary and the NHS to make sure those services are in place.
Polly Latham.
Does the Secretary of State agree that if girls aged between 16 and 18 are persuaded to be married instead of continuing their education, they're likely to be disadvantaged for the rest of their life and less economically active than those who complete an education until at least 18?
Minister.
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, Mr. Speaker. Education is important, and it is obviously wrong when girls get married at an early age against their will. I know my honourable friend has done a lot of work to raise these issues, and the government is listening carefully to the debate on the legal age of marriage, and we continue to keep this under review. Tackling forced marriage is one of our key priorities, and I'm proud that we made forced marriage an offence in 2014.
Let's head up to Kingston upon Hull with Dame Diana Johnson. Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The All-Party Parliamentary Group on Sexual and Reproductive Health recent report found that women were increasingly having difficulty accessing contraception through cuts to budgets and complex commissioning arrangements. The former past president of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, Professor Dame Leslie Regan, has pointed out that Viagra was made available to men over the counter without a prescription within a year of being licensed, but the safe progesterone-only pill, which has been licensed for over 60 years, means we still don't trust women to get it over the counter at the chemist. So what is the Minister going to do about this blatant discrimination against women?
Secretary Truss.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and I will take the issue up with the Health Secretary.
Chris Loder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Being gay in the farming community is incredibly hard, not least because of isolation. The Gay Farmers Helpline plays a vital support role, but has highlighted a very high suicide rate. Can I ask what the Minister is doing, please, to support gay farmers, and will she meet with me and representatives of that helpline to see what else we can do?
Secretary Truss.
Well, farming is a vital industry in Britain, and I want all farmers to feel supported. I applaud the work of groups like AgRespect in supporting LGBT farmers to thrive, and I'd be delighted to meet with my honourable friend and his colleagues to discuss what more we can do.
We're now going to move on to Prime Minister's questions. Now I know why you've been in Lincolnshire. Right, let us start with question 1. Jamie Stone to the Prime Minister.
Number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Jamie Stone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, the unanimous decision by Highland Council planning to grant consent for the UK's vertical space takeoff in Sutherland is extremely good news. I hope that the Prime Minister agrees with me that this would be extremely good for the local economy of the Highlands, but also would provide a huge opportunity for the UK economy in terms of the international satellite market.
Prime Minister.
I absolutely. I congratulate Launch UK on what they are doing, and as he rightly says, it will create 250 full-time jobs, 130 at the facility in Forres, and I'm no doubt launch the UK on a path to ever greater presence in the global satellite market.
Lee Rowley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday evening, the Prime Minister announced a series of changes that none of us ever wanted to see to keep the virus as low as possible, and residents are understandably concerned and anxious. Would the Prime Minister reassure us all and my constituents in North East Derbyshire that the primary focus of the government remains on protecting both lives and, just as importantly, livelihoods?
Minister.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend can certainly reassure his constituents that our purpose and the purpose of the package that I think carried overwhelming support yesterday in this House is to continue to drive down that R number whilst keeping businesses open and keeping pupils in school.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 3 months ago today, the Prime Minister said, "Test and trace can be a real game changer for us." He was backed up by the Health Secretary, who said, "Finding where people who test positive are is the single most important thing that we can do to stop the spread of the virus." Yesterday, the Prime Minister said the complete opposite. Standing there, he said testing and tracing has very little or nothing to do with the spread or transmission of the disease. Both positions cannot be right. Which one is it, Prime Minister?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is an obvious fact of biology and epidemiology that, alas, this disease is transmitted by human contact or aerosol contact. but it is one of the great advantages of NHS Test and Trace, which we did not have working, alas, earlier in the pandemic. We simply didn't have it in the spring, and it is the result is that we now have the ability to see in granular detail where the epidemic is breaking out, exactly which groups are being infected. That's why we've been able to deliver the local lockdowns, and that's why we're able to tell now at this stage that it is necessary to take the decisive action that we are, and which I think he supports, or he did yesterday anyway, to drive the virus down, keep kids in school and keep our economy moving. That's the point, Mr. Speaker.
Starmer. So why yesterday did the Prime Minister say that testing and tracing had very little or nothing to do with the spread or transmission of the disease?
Mr. Speaker, I hesitate to reprove the right honourable gentleman for a flaw he seems sometimes to fall into is not listening to my previous answer. Mr. Speaker, I gave a very clear answer. The answer is it is simply, and sadly, it is an epidemiological fact that transmission of the virus takes place by a human contact from person to person. What Test and Trace enables us to do is to isolate the cases of the virus with ever greater detail, which we weren't able to do before, Mr. Speaker. And thanks to the efforts of NHS Test and Trace, many thousands of people, trainees, nurses, doctors, young people, members of the armed services, we're not only testing more capacity, testing more than any other country in Europe, but capacity today is at a record high. And I think you should pay tribute to their work.
Mr. Speaker, I listened to the answer that the Prime Minister gave to the questions. That's why I asked him the question, because yesterday he said the complete opposite of what he said today. Everybody who was in the chamber, everybody who reads Hansard will see it. And he talks about testing. Mr. Speaker, can I remind the Prime Minister that last week, before the Liaison Committee, he admitted testing currently has huge problems. Dido Harding said, we plainly don't have enough testing capacity. The Health Secretary said fixing testing would take weeks. Pretending there isn't a problem is part of the problem, Prime Minister. It's unclear, and let's test what the Prime Minister's explanation is. Is the explanation for the problems that we haven't got enough capacity? It says which problem? The problem that he acknowledged 1 week ago before the Liaison Committee. Mr. Speaker, is the explanation from the Prime Minister that we haven't got enough capacity because nobody could have expected the rise in demand? That's the Dido Harding defence. Or is it we've got all the capacity we need, it's just that people are being unreasonable in asking for tests? That's the Hancock defence. So which is it?
Mr. Speaker, I must say I think that the continual attacks by the opposition on Dido Harding in particular are unseemly and unjustified. And I think that her teams have done an outstanding job in recruiting people from a standing start. This is not for a moment to deny the anxiety of those who want tests, which I readily accept. Of course, we would love to have much more testing instantly, and it is thanks to the efforts of NHS Test and Trace that we are not only at a record high today, testing more people than any other European country, but to get to the point that he raised, Mr. Speaker, we're going to go up to 500,000 tests by the end of October. That is the work of Dido Harding and her team, and I think actually, again, you know, what we want to hear, and what I frankly want to hear, is more of the spirit of togetherness that we had yesterday, Mr. Speaker, because this is an opportunity to support NHS Test and Trace. This is an opportunity to get behind that scheme, to encourage people to believe in it and in its efficacy. Instead, he constantly knocks it from the sidelines, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, sorry, I think the whip. I'll just say to the whip, there's a little bit of rowdiness coming from here, also from your good self, which I normally never have from you, and we're having a little bit from this side. I want to be able to hear the Prime Minister. When I can't hear the Prime Minister, I do worry about the people who are watching proceedings. If we have further comment, please do so. Speak to me afterwards. Right, where are we up to? Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister knows my complaint is not with the NHS, it's with the government. My wife works for the NHS. My mother worked for the NHS. My sister works for the NHS. So I'm not going to take lectures from the Prime Minister on supporting the NHS. The Prime Minister says we've got capacity, goes on and on about capacity. Let's test that. 3 weeks ago, millions of children went back to school. That's a good thing. Then the inevitable happened. Kids get coughs, bugs, flu. That's what happens. It's in the job description. But there's no effective system in place to deal with it. Many can't get tests quickly. Schools are allocated only 10 tests. Many wait days for the results. The outcome is obvious. Child and siblings off school, mum, dad or carer off work, and in some cases all year groups off school. How on earth did we get into this mess?
Prime Minister.
Come on, Mr. Speaker. He knows perfectly well that, and he'll have read the advice from the 4 chief medical officers that there's an exceptionally small risk to children of primary and secondary school age from this disease. He knows that children have a significantly lower rate of infection. That's all in the letter that they've published today. But he also knows that we are doing our level best to get every child a test who has symptoms, and further, that thanks to the efforts of teachers in this country, of parents, pupils, 99.9% of our schools are now back. And in spite of all his attempts, I may say, throughout the summer, to sow doubt on the idea that schools were safe. The people of this country had more common sense, Mr. Speaker.
Such a poor defence. That's such a poor defence. The point isn't whether the children have got COVID. It's that they've got COVID symptoms, and then they're off school. The government's own department shows that 1 in 8 children are off school this week. That disrupts their education. Whether it's COVID symptoms or other symptoms is nothing to the point. If the Prime Minister doesn't see that, he's really out of touch with families and what they're going through in schooling day in, day out in the last few weeks. The reality is, losing control of testing is a major reason why the Prime Minister is losing control of this virus. As a result, he's phasing in health measures, restrictions which we do support. But at the same time, he's phasing out economic support. Health measures and economic measures are now dangerously out of sync. Let me quote the Director General of the CBI. There can be no avoiding the crushing blow new measures will bring for thousands of firms. It's vital, she says, that all announcements of restrictions go hand in hand with clarity on the business support to protect jobs. Why wasn't that announced yesterday?
Mr. Speaker, let's be in absolutely no doubt that the work that this government has done to protect the economy of this country, to support the jobs of 12 million people through the furlough scheme, an overall expenditure of about £160 billion, has been unexampled anywhere else in the world. And I think he should pay tribute to the Chancellor and his work. And we will go forward with further creative and imaginative schemes to keep our economy moving. And that is the essence, Mr. Speaker, of the plan, of the proposals that he talks about our president. He supported them last night, or he supported them yesterday, Mr. Speaker. I hope he continues to support them. The essence of what we're saying, Mr. Speaker, is that we want to depress the virus, but keep pupils in school and keep our economy moving. And that is the single best thing we can do to support firms across the country.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not asking about the support that was being put in place in the past. We support that. I'm asking about the support that's needed now, particularly in light of the restrictions announced yesterday. Mr. Speaker, this is not theoretical. Yesterday, 6,000 jobs were lost at Whitbread, one of the major employers in the hospitality sector. The CBI, the TUC and trade unions, the Federation of Small Businesses, the British Chamber of Commerce, the Governor of the Bank of England, they're all calling on the Prime Minister to stop and rethink. Support the businesses affected. Don't withdraw furlough. We've been saying it for months. When is the Prime Minister finally going to act?
Well, Mr. Speaker, these are indeed tough times, and I have no doubt that many businesses, many employees are feeling a great deal of anxiety and uncertainty, and we will do our level best to protect them throughout this period. But we will get through this, Mr. Speaker, by precisely the methods that we have outlined and that were agreed upon in this House yesterday. And I may say, I think that what the reality of the opposition position has been exposed. The cat's out of the bag, Mr. Speaker, because it was his shadow education secretary who said of the present crisis, she said, "Don't let a good crisis go to waste." That's the real approach of the Labour Party, Mr. Speaker, seeking to create political opportunity out of a crisis, out of the difficulties and dangers this country is going through, whilst we are taking the tough decisions. The tough decisions to get this virus down, Mr. Speaker, to keep our education system going and to keep our economy moving. He supported it yesterday. I hope he will, in a spirit of togetherness and unity, that he will continue to give it his support.
Ben Bradley.
Mr. Speaker, our local football clubs are hugely important to our communities. Mansfield Town is a fine example of a club that both works with and invests in our town. But many sports clubs around the country have found that their hopes of welcoming fans back to stadiums next month have been dashed. So, given that many Football League clubs are so reliant on gate receipts to be viable, can my right honourable friend assure me that he'll do everything possible to support these clubs, both as businesses, but for the communities that rely on them too?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know what a passionate supporter my honourable friend is of Mansfield Town, and I can tell him, and I want to thank, by the way, John and Carolyn Radford and all they have done for the club, and I can tell him that the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport is in active consultations with clubs across the country to see what we can do to help.
We now come to the SNP leader, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last night, the Prime Minister and leaders of the devolved governments announced restrictions aimed at stopping the number of COVID cases reaching a predicted 50,000 a day by mid-October. But there are other major threats that we face this October. There's another set of numbers, and all of this is of the Tory government's own making. 1 million jobs at risk if furlough ends early. 30 billion a year bill to the taxpayer from a no-deal Brexit. And today we learn 7,000 trucks queuing for days at Dover. Mr. Speaker, if those numbers become a reality, the Prime Minister is leading us into another winter of discontent. Mr. Speaker, our First Minister has shown leadership at all fronts during this pandemic. However, the responsibility and powers for extending the furlough scheme lie with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. The Prime Minister must announce an immediate extension, no half measures, no half-baked projects to this vital and life-saving scheme. Will the Prime Minister show leadership required and save the jobs?
Prime Minister.
Well, I noticed that both the leader of the Scottish Nationalist Party and the leader of the opposition now support an indefinite extension of the furlough scheme. That's what he said, Mr. Speaker. What we will do, as I've said throughout, is continue to put our arms around the people of this country going through a very tough time and come up with the appropriate creative and imaginative schemes to keep them in work and keep the economy moving. That's the essence of our approach.
Ian Blackford.
That's so poor, Mr. Speaker. What we're talking about is protecting the jobs of people today. It's not indefinite, and nobody, Prime Minister, has asked for that. Mr. Speaker, the first steps to any recovery is admitting that there is a problem. Even the Governor of the Bank of England is telling the Prime Minister to stop and rethink. The solution for millions of people right now is an extension, Prime Minister, of the furlough scheme beyond October. The alternative is putting 61,000 jobs in Scotland at risk. Yesterday, the only reassurance the Prime Minister gave those Scottish workers was saying that he would throw his arms around them. Prime Minister, I can tell you the last thing those 61,000 Scots are looking for is a hug from you. They need the security of knowing that they can hold on to their jobs and incomes for themselves and their families. Time is running out. Workers are facing the dole today. Will the government instruct the Chancellor to extend the furlough scheme and stop 1 million workers being sold onto the scrap heap by this government?
Prime Minister.
What I can certainly tell him is that, of course, the furlough scheme has already been extended until the end of October. People should be no doubt about that. And as I've said before, we will continue to provide the best support we can possibly give to keep people, get people, and new jobs are being created, Mr. Speaker, get people into work whilst suppressing the virus. And I know that he may not know, I can imagine that he doesn't want a hug from me, but that was a metaphor, Mr. Speaker, and perhaps it's physically incarnated by the £12.7 billion of Barnett consequentials that we're seeing come from the UK Exchequer to support people across the whole of our country.
I suspect you might get a hug now from Andrew Bowie.
Oh, well, I could possibly, Mr. Speaker, not in present company. Mr. Speaker, it's interesting that the leader of the Scottish National Party went on jobs, given that on this side of the House we voted this week and last to protect 500,000 jobs, enshrining Scotland's most important market, our internal UK market, in statute. Why does my right honourable friend think the SNP did not support this bill?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I have absolutely no idea. It's totally baffling because this is a bill that underpins a massive transfer of powers back to Scotland from Brussels. About 70 powers and prerogatives go back to Scotland, which they would throw away again. As Mr. Speaker, they would throw away again the entire beautiful, glistening haul of the UK's or Scotland's spectacular marine wealth. Hand our fisheries straight back. Hand Scotland's fisheries straight back to Brussels. That's what they want to do.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Last week, a RSPB report noted that the UK has seen a lost decade for nature, with the government failing to reach 17 out of 20 targets that it had signed up to. Now, there's a major UN biodiversity summit next week. It is a vital moment to put this right and to show some real leadership. Now, the EU's Biodiversity Summit aims to protect a minimum 30% of land and sea for nature by 2030. So, will the Prime Minister commit now to at least match that goal, 30% of land and sea for nature by 2030, and deliver the funding via the forthcoming spending review?
Prime Minister.
Well, the Honourable Right Honourable Lady simply cannot be unaware that the campaign to get the world's leaders to sign up to a leaders' declaration, Mr. Speaker, on biodiversity has been led over the last few weeks by this government. And it is this government, you know that, she knows that, Mr. Speaker, it's this government that devised the Charter, it's this government that's leading the world in protecting biodiversity across the planet, and we will put in the funding. We pioneered the 30% idea, and we will certainly put in all the funding required.
Gareth Bacon.
Mr. Speaker, there's growing concern in my constituency of Orpington and across the country about the rising number of illegal crossings across the Channel. In order to stop these dangerous journeys, to save lives and to protect our borders, the UK must deter people from making these crossings. The law in this area is complex, so can my right honourable friend assure my constituents and the country that at the very latest a comprehensive bill to deal with this problem will be brought before the House following the next Queen's speech?
I thank my honourable friend because he's completely right that the legal position is currently very difficult because of the inflexible and rigid Dublin regulation for returns. And what's happening now, and so people think there is a way in that is legally very difficult to resist. Tragic for those who are coming across in rubber dinghies or children's paddling pools, cheated by gangs as they are. We must find a better way of doing this. Once we are out of the EU, able to make our own return arrangements, able to settle our own laws in this matter, I've no doubt that we'll find a way forward.
Graham Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do hope respectfully the Prime Minister isn't having problems with his memory, because just yesterday, can I remind him, we've just had a recent exchange there where metaphorically you promised to put your arms around the British people and support jobs and the economy. Now we know that the CBI and the TUC, businesses and unions, employers and workers, and now even the Bank of England are united in a call for a targeted expansion in the COVID job retention scheme. And make no mistake, there's a tsunami of job losses in the pipeline within 38 days. So will the Prime Minister please listen to that advice and take urgent action? And I'd like a yes or no answer, please.
Prime Minister.
Well, I think that the honourable member is entirely right about the gravity of the situation. And although it is true that some firms are powering through this, many face very difficult circumstances. And that's why we've put in the support that we have. That's why don't forget there's the job retention bonus at the end of the year to help people, firms to keep people in employment. But also that's why we're looking at a massive package now of investment in jobs and growth in the medium and the short, medium and the long term. And you look at the £2 billion Kickstart fund that we've already put in place, about £640 billion of investment overall in infrastructure. And what I can tell the House is, in addition to the package that I set out yesterday, as I said earlier on, as I said to the Right Honourable Gentleman, there will be creative and imaginative measures from the Chancellor to help people through this crisis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, like you, one of my top priorities is improving education and spreading opportunity across Devon and the West Country. I welcome the new £1 billion school rebuilding programme, which will help refurbish 50 schools from next year. Tiverton High School in my constituency is currently in a flood zone, but we do have permission to build a new school and move out of the flood zone. So Sammy Crook, the head teacher, the governors and the Devon County Council are all backing this scheme. Could I make an early bid for Tiverton High School? Could you back us to have a new school in the rebuilding programme to raise the aspiration and the opportunity for the great young people of Tiverton?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the cause of education in Tiverton could have no more fervent and more effective advocate than my honourable friend. And I can tell him, although the first 50 schools, the first 50 have not yet been announced, I know that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Education, will have heard that powerful cry, and I have no doubt that he will be answered.
Patrick Reddy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does he understand that as long as these powers are reserved, it is the government that has to meet the costs that come with the pandemic? So he can either do that by extending the job retention schemes, especially for those who are excluded, or through sector-specific support, or he can pay the long-term price of long-term unemployment, increased social security, and all the damage that comes to the economy and the society with it. So which of those is it going to be? What is his vision for building back better?
I thank the Honourable. Very simply, Mr. Speaker, it is to keep doing what we have doing, but to intensify our support for every part of the union, from spaceports, Mr. Speaker, to backing our armed services throughout the whole of the UK, to investing in our healthcare. That is what we will do. And the overall Barnett consequentials, as I've said so far, are £12.7 billion, and we will continue to provide that support, Mr. Speaker.
James Wilde.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Saturday, I was at Norwich City's match as part of the pilot to let fans back into football, and it's disappointing that the reopening has now been postponed. And with Kings Lynn Town, Mansfield and many other clubs and sports facing a real threat to their viability with no fans coming into the grounds, will my honourable friend urgently look at the Sports Recovery Fund to ensure their viability and their place at the heart of our local communities?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it grieves me to see football clubs, Mansfield, others, Norwich City, not able to go back in the way that they want to right now, and I totally sympathise with him and with the fans. And I really wish we did not have to do this now. I really wish we did not have to do this now. The best way, obviously, to get through it, as I say, is to follow the advice and suppress the virus. But in the meantime, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, is looking actively at solutions to help Norwich City and other clubs.
Let's head up to Adrian Shots with Neil Gray. Neil Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy, but in this case it is essential. It's clear that doing the right thing to stop the spread of COVID-19 is going to have a social, business and economic impact. But as yet, the UK government haven't moved to ensure in this new phase that there is full security for those doing the right thing. So will he do the right thing and look now as a minimum at the support available to businesses, in particular the self-employed who may need to self-isolate repeatedly or be back in the realm of zero income, extend the furlough scheme and ensure the limited universal credit uplift is expanded to legacy benefits and made permanent?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable gentleman is right in the sense that, of course, the government is going to come forward with further measures. I don't think that it would be sensible simply to extend the current existing furlough scheme in its present form beyond the end of October, but we will do everything we can to support businesses, to support those in jobs, and indeed the self-employed, as the honourable gentleman rightly says.
Secretary Batty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents in Meriden understand the need for more housing, but the majority of Meriden is Greenbelt land. And across Meriden, in places like Balsall Common, Dorridge, Knoll, Dickens Heath, Hockley Heath, Catherine de Barnes and Hampton and Arden, residents are quite rightly concerned about the pressures on the Greenbelt. So can the Prime Minister confirm that his government is a brownfield first government, and can he also confirm he'll do everything he can to protect our precious Greenbelt?
I certainly can, Mr. Speaker. It was a former Labour planning minister who said the Green Belt is a Labour achievement and we intend to build on it, is what he said. The government's approach is entirely different. Our planning reform will not change. That's what they want to do, Mr. Speaker. We will not change existing policy to protect Green Belt, and our housing targets, which are very, very ambitious, will focus, as he rightly says, on brownfield.
Heading to South London with Florence Eshalome. Florence Eshalome.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unsafe cladding is leaving hundreds of leaseholders across Vauxhall unable to sell or remortgage their properties. The EWS1 forms are not being used as intended and leaving my constituents trapped between risk-adverse lenders and irresponsible building owners. They have been waiting 3 years already. So can the Prime Minister tell me what steps he's taking now to resolve this really dangerous situation?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honourable, because I am aware of this problem of people facing real disadvantaged leaseholders and others because of the of unsafe cladding still on their buildings. I think it is disgraceful, and both ACM and HPL cladding, in my view, should come off as fast as possible when we are investing massively to achieve that as fast as we can. But I sincerely appreciate the problem that she raises.
Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2006, Menheniot Parish Council were told of improvement plans to their dangerous junction on the A38, something I've long campaigned for. But 2 months ago, the regional director of the southwest part of Highways England told me this was not going to happen, blaming the change from the old Highways Agency. Can my right honourable friend tell me when, if ever, the people of Menheniot will finally see shovels in the ground?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to my honourable friend because she gave me advance notice of this question. I think this is really a case for Project Speed, Mr. Speaker, and I hope that Highways England, who are currently undertaking a safety study of the A38 between Bodmin and Saltash, will be able to accelerate their work and get on with Menheniot Junction as fast as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before lockdown, children on free school meals finished education on average 18 months behind their classmates, and the gap was getting worse. Schools closed, and a quarter of these children did less than 1 hour's schoolwork a day. Lockdown was temporary, but the impact could be lifelong. To help these children catch up, and in the spirit of togetherness invoked by the Prime Minister earlier on, will his government give time for my bill to close the digital divide and give children on free school meals access to internet in their homes?
Prime Minister.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady because she's raising a very important point, and getting kids into school, getting kids back into school has been the most important objective that we've had over the last few months, and I'm glad that it's got underway. But she's right in what she says about the digital divide, and that's why we're investing massively in online education, giving many thousands of 220,000 laptops and tablets, and putting routers in schools across the country. That is what we are going to do, and I want to see a world in which every school in our country has full gigabit broadband with the equipment that will give the pupils the equipment and the access to the internet that they need.
That's waffling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree that as the UK's performing arts are a global gold standard, which are not only the envy of the world, but also a vital showcase for UK PLC across the world, we should treasure it and we should look after that industry? And we've had the furlough and other schemes, job retention schemes, but there are those that have fallen through the cracks, and that, Mr. Speaker, are the freelancers. We must do something to protect the freelancers, the actors, the costumiers, the prop makers, many others. Can we do something to look after those people?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that is a very, very important point, because obviously the job retention scheme has been very, very effective in keeping people in work, but there are, of course, people who don't have employment of that kind. That's why we have given them 1.57 billion to support the creative culture media sectors, including the theatres. We will do whatever we can to support the freelancers that he describes, because they are the backbone of our theatrical world, which is, as he knows, and is the jewel in the crown of the London cultural economy.
Returning to Scotland with Ronnie Cowan. Ronnie Cowan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The word is that Downing Street is taking control of the upcoming review of gambling legislation. Is this true? And if so, will Number 10 consider all the recommendations made by the APPG on gambling-related harm in our report published in June?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what I can certainly tell the honourable gentleman is that I am not an enthusiast for encouraging the spread of gambling in this country.
Anthony Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like the vast majority of the British public, I support the new restrictions. And the Right Honourable friend, the Prime Minister, said we will get through this. But long term, there are only 3 routes out of this pandemic. 1 is to eradicate the virus, 2, gain herd immunity, or 3, suppress the virus and reduce the deaths until a vaccine or highly effective treatment arrives, such as the ones that the brilliant researchers of South Cambridgeshire are working on. Will my Right Honourable friend, the Prime Minister, tell me which one of these 3 routes is the government taking us?
Prime Minister.
Number 3, Mr. Speaker.
Final question, Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Only time will tell, Prime Minister, whether the predictions made this week by the medical advisers about deaths and infections of coronavirus have any credibility, or whether they're as exaggerated as the claims that there will be 500,000 deaths within weeks made at the beginning of the year. What is not in dispute, however, is that the scare tactics being used and the regulatory actions taken will have an immediate impact on high streets, the hospitality industry, and further devastation for the aviation industry. Since the economic consequences are borne by people, businesses and local economies, will the government make a commitment to, first of all, retaining continued support for employment, giving resources to devolved authorities to help local economies, and suspending air passenger duty to stave off bankruptcies and save jobs?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he makes the Honourable makes a powerful point of scepticism about the medical forecasts. All I can say is that everybody should look at what's already happened in the first phases of this pandemic and be in no doubt that it is possible that such a thing could happen again. And it's precisely to avoid that we are taking the steps now that we are, because a stitch in time saves 9. And there'll be far more damage to the economy throughout our country if we failed to control the virus now, and we were obliged to put in seriously damaging lockdown measures that really affected every business in the country. And that's why we're taking the approach that we are now, and that's why I think it has the support, and I hope it has the support of him and his party as well. But I can certainly tell him that the advantage of this approach is that it will allow us not just to keep that virus down if we all follow the guidance, if we all do follow the package that we've set out, keep that virus down, but also enable education to continue and our economy to go forward. And of course, we will continue to support businesses in Northern Ireland and across the country throughout the period.
In order to allow the safe exit of funeral members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next,
I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order. Now come to the urgent question. Tim Farron.
Mr Speaker, to ask the Secretary of State if he will make a statement on the end of the eviction moratorium.
Minister Pincher.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I congratulate the honourable gentleman on securing this urgent question. Mr Speaker, the government has taken unprecedented action to support renters by banning evictions for 6 months, preventing people getting into financial hardship and helping businesses to pay salaries. We've boosted the welfare safety net and increased the local housing allowance rates to cover the lowest 30% of market rents. We've made available £180 million for the discretionary housing payments this year for local councils to distribute to support those renters who require additional support. We've now introduced comprehensive measures to ensure renters continue to be protected over the autumn and winter following the resumption of possession proceedings on Monday. However, we must strike a balance so that landlords are able to access justice alongside measures to protect the vulnerable. This is vital to the long-term health of the private rented sector. We've worked with the judiciary to put in place new court arrangements that seek to ensure appropriate support to all parties within the current statutory framework. The judiciary will look to prioritise the most serious cases, including antisocial behaviour, fraud and egregious rent arrears. New court rules also require landlords to reactivate any claim they've made before 3rd of August and to provide information to the court on the effect of the Covid-19 pandemic on the tenant and their dependents. A court would be likely, Mr. Speaker, to take a very dim view of any landlord who tried to circumvent this requirement or mislead the court by not disclosing relevant information where known. To help keep people in their homes over the winter, Mr. Speaker, we've changed the law, increasing notice periods to 6 months in all but the most serious cases. Tenants now served notice will not be required to move over winter, while empowering landlords to take action where necessary, for example, where a tenant's antisocial behaviour severely affects their neighbours' quality of life. To further support renters, guidance has been issued to bailiffs by my right honourable friend the Lord Chancellor to ensure that possession orders are not enforced in areas where lockdown restrictions are in place or over the Christmas period, except in the most serious circumstances. Our package, Mr. Speaker, strikes a fair balance, supporting landlords to act in the most serious cases whilst keeping the public, including renters, safe. Comprehensive guidance has been published for landlords and tenants to explain these new arrangements and the possession process in courts. Mr. Speaker, the government is clear. All these measures are to protect renters over this period. They are kept under constant review in the light of evidence on public health. We're prepared to take further measures as they are needed to protect landlords and tenants alike.
We now come to Tim Farron.
I'm really grateful to you, Mr. Speaker, for granting this urgent question. The ban on possession proceedings had given many private renters protection against the economic impact of coronavirus. At least the roof over their heads couldn't be taken away. That protection ended on Sunday, and now 55,000 households are in immediate danger of losing their homes. These are the 55,000 served eviction notices between March and August. You see, their landlords were not required to give 6 months' notice, and so courts could be processing their eviction orders as I speak. In addition, by the way, asylum seekers who fled to Britain for sanctuary will receive eviction notices with immediate effect. In the same period last year, for context, just 21,000 eviction notices were served. The scale of the hardship that is now being unleashed is unprecedented and no one is ready for it. Shelter estimate that a colossal 322,000 private renters are newly in arrears since the pandemic began, so things will get worse even more quickly. Unless he acts now, the Secretary of State will break his promise made in this place on the 18th of March that no renter who has lost income due to coronavirus will be forced out of their home. The Minister insists there are new measures to provide protection. That isn't so. The new civil procedures rules require the landlord seeking possession to describe the effect of the pandemic on their tenant's circumstances, but judges have zero authority to take these circumstances into account, so in practice it provides no protection. And we recognise too that some small landlords will be unable to pay their mortgages or put food on their table. So I remind the Minister of his promise to landlords that none should face unmanageable debt. The Minister believed the eviction moratorium was justified as the pandemic took hold in spring, but as we battle a second wave in the harsh depths of winter, aren't such measures justified still? Now, I don't ask the Minister to kick the can down the road. Instead, I ask for an extension to the eviction moratorium so that the underlying problems can be solved. The 55,000 at risk of homelessness today can't afford to pay their rent now. They're not likely to have the money in a few months' time, and they aren't going to have enough money for a deposit for a new place if they're evicted. So very briefly, the 4 questions are these. First, enact a further 6-month moratorium on the bulk of evictions starting today, but this time don't waste the 6 months. So the second act, amend Section 8 evictions to give judges discretion over tenants who are in need. Third, he should fast-track legislation to repeal Section 21 no-fault evictions. As his manifesto promised, throughout this crisis, the government has swiftly moved through legislation when it's needed to. There's nothing more urgent than this to prevent avoidable homelessness. And finally, he should provide a comprehensive package of financial support for those in arrears so that when the moratorium does end, we do not see the appalling misery of mass homelessness. Whether it's in the Lakes or in London, the British people are united in their decency, in their belief that the virus should not bring families to their knees and dump them on the street. The Minister has the power to prevent a pandemic of homelessness. I beg him to use that power, take the actions that I have outlined. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful again to the honourable gentleman for securing his urgent question. I'd remind him of the unprecedented series of measures that we have undertaken to protect renters during this very difficult time. Court actions have been stayed on eviction for 6 months, the longest period of intervention in our history. I should remind him that it is the courts themselves that wish to reopen and begin to hear cases again, because the Master of the Roll, Sir Terence Etherington, and Mr. Justice Knowles have made it quite clear they believe that landlords and tenants alike should have access to justice, so the courts should not remain closed. The courts are able to prioritise cases, and of course it is a matter for them. They will prioritise the most egregious cases first. He quoted some figures. I can tell him, Mr. Speaker, that the most recent figures suggest that 3,022 applications have been made to the courts for evictions. That's 89% down on the same period last year. The fact of the matter is that landlords are acting responsibly and talking to their tenants to avoid such actions, and it is also due to the unprecedented measures that we've introduced, Mr. Speaker, that have resulted in such a low figure of notices made. We will continue to keep our policies under review. We will act fairly to landlords and tenants alike.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I draw attention to my entry in the Register of Members' Interests. Does my honourable friend agree that this is about achieving an appropriate balance between the unprecedented protection that was rightly provided by this government and was supported by many landlords themselves, and the right of landlords, many of whom rely on the rents for their livelihoods, to protect their properties in the face of egregious behaviour?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I quite agree with my honourable friend. It is about striking a fair balance. There are many landlords in this country. The private rented sector accounts for something like 21% of all houses available in our country to live in. And many of those are owned by smaller landlords who need rental income in order to pay their bills and survive. That is why, whilst extending the period of notice for evictions under Section 21, we have reduced the period of notice to 4 weeks for the most serious matters such as antisocial behaviour, domestic abuse and violence, fraud, and egregious rent arrears, which means rent arrears which predate the COVID emergency. I think that's a fair balance, Mr. Speaker, and I suggest the House should support it.
We now come to Shadow Secretary of State Tango Devon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I congratulate the honourable gentleman for securing this urgent question, because it's scandalous that this government is lifting the ban just as we're heading into a second wave of coronavirus. The Chief Medical Officer gave a stark warning, but 16 public health bodies and charities also warned of a rise in COVID infections if the government forces people into homelessness or overcrowding. In March, as we all know, the Secretary of State promised no renter who has lost income due due to coronavirus will be forced out of their home, nor will any landlord face unmanageable debts. And the government has reneged on that promise. They failed to change the law to prevent automatic evictions. The court might take a dim view, but with Section 21 still on the statute book, which the government said they would get rid of, the courts will have no choice. The government failed to prevent financial hardship, whatever the minister says. There are many people struggling with rent, and they failed to deal with arrears, which have built up to over 300,000 people in arrears since the start of the crisis. Welsh Labour government has a plan to prevent evictions and homelessness, but as with testing, this government had summer to develop their plan and wasted it. They now choose to withdraw the protection of evictions ban exactly when it's most needed. There's been last-minute chaotic announcements creating a complex and confusing situation. So, could the Minister confirm that extension of notice periods won't help those who were served notice before 29th of August? What steps is the government taking to help tenants and landlords navigate this complex situation? Why do lockdown regulations for Newcastle and Gateshead have no rules barring bailiffs from enforcing evictions? What is the government doing to prevent illegal evictions, reportedly up by 50%? Why won't they stick to their commitment to remove Section 21 and automatic evictions? And are they trying to collect any data that gives an accurate picture of the problem? We're likely to see a rise in evictions and homelessness because of this government incompetence. The government must act now to prevent a wave of evictions, just as COVID is rising this winter, and honour their promise to landlords and renters.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the government has honoured its promise to landlords and to renters. That is why we have introduced the most significant package of support for people suffering from the emergency in our history. £35 billion has helped over 9 million people on the furlough scheme. We've introduced the local housing allowance and increased it to the 30th percentile of local market rents. That will increase the annual incomes of those people in receipt of it by something like £600 a year. The Next Steps accommodation programme is providing 3,000 new homes for those people who have found themselves homeless to make sure they receive long-term help. The Honourable Lady mentions the Welsh Government and says it has a plan. Well, we'd all like to know what it is because they've announced some form of help, but they haven't told us when it starts or what the amount is. I can tell the House, Mr. Speaker, that we've made very clear what the rules are in lockdown areas. The Lord Chancellor has written to the Association of Bailiffs to make it clear, and further guidance will be issued. We will continue, as I say, Mr. Speaker, to keep our measures under review, but we will continue also to support landlords and renters alike through this crisis.
Greg McKinley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll draw the House attention to my register of interest. There are 2.5 million landlords in this country. Most have just one property, often indebted. For retired landlords, it can form the backbone of their retirement income. Good landlords repair properties, they get them back into use, and they provide millions of properties that would otherwise fall to the public and quasi-sectors. But sadly, too often, landlords are demonised. Would my right honourable friend agree that it is now right and fair that we allow courts to exercise due discretion, sensitivity, as they always do, in deciding on the correct pathways from now on?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes a valid point. Landlords in our country provide a very valuable and important service to the many people who rent. Demonising landlords, forcing good landlords out of business, will only result in fewer properties available to rent. It may result in more of those properties being rented out for Airbnb or by less scrupulous landlords. So my honourable friend is absolutely right. We have tried to be fair to renters. We have also tried to be fair to landlords, and the package of measures that we introduced on the 29th of August is fair to both. It is important that those landlords who need access to justice are able to get it, and those landlords who face egregious rent arrears, who face antisocial behaviour, who face issues of domestic abuse, are able to repossess their properties, whilst at the same time those people who through no fault of their own have got into difficulty because of the COVID-19 epidemic are helped.
David Linden, the SNP spokesperson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I congratulate my honourable friend on securing today's urgent question. We've heard from colleagues about the urgency of the situation in England, which, as an observer in these proceedings, I can see clearly needs urgent action, and I would urge the Minister to reflect on that today. But as a result of SNP government action, there is a ban on evictions in Scotland until March 2021. The Scottish Government's also brought forward a new £10 million tenant hardship loan fund, as well as a further £3 million additional funding for discretionary housing payments. So I would urge the Minister to once again look north to Scotland and see what protecting tenants really looks like. But there are some points I want to raise with the Minister today relating to support for asylum seekers in terms of accommodation. Firstly, would the Minister agree that no one refused asylum or insecure status should be made street homeless given the public health emergency? And further, commit that the Government won't follow through on its decision to subject vulnerable asylum seekers to evictions and street homelessness without the explicit consent of the affected local authority and Public Health Director. Now, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister's announcement yesterday is a sage reminder of the precarious situation we find ourselves in as we head into a second wave. The last thing that people need is for the Government to pull the rug from under their feet. So I very much urge the Minister to act now and protect people when they need our help most.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman's for his contribution. He will know, of course, that the Scottish legal system is different from the system in England. He will know that tenancy arrangements are different in Scotland from those here in England. He'll also know that the Scottish courts began their actions some several weeks ago, whereas we maintain our stay until the 21st of September. I note what he says about discretionary housing payments. I'm sure he'll note what I've said about the 180 millions that we made available to local authorities to help people who have difficulty with their housing needs in England. He mentions asylum seekers. I'm sure that Her Majesty's Government will always do its duty by asylum seekers, and so will the courts.
Sarah Dines. Not here. We now come to Clive Betts, of the Select Committee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I have two simple asks of the Housing Minister. First of all, will he recognise that there will be people in dire financial hardship who simply struggle and can't pay their rents? I've heard what he said about help through discretionary housing payments. Will he continue to monitor that? And if local authorities are saying they haven't got sufficient to help people in real need, will he look at expanding that amount of money? And secondly, with regard to the issue of discretion, will he confirm that as long as landlords have talked to their tenants and presented their financial information to the courts, where applying for a Section 21 notice or a Grounds 8 notice for a possession on grounds of rent arrears, the courts have no discretion to reject those applications at all? So will he give further consideration to those points, do what the Select Committee has asked, and strengthen the pre-action protocol to give the courts more discretion?
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and we always listen with great care to the Chairman of the Select Committee. I can confirm to him that we will keep all of our arrangements, including our financial provisions, under review as this situation develops. It probably has some time to go before things begin to get better. He mentions Section 21. He knows that the Government is committed to amending Section 21, to repealing it as part of our Renters Reform Bill, and we will do that at the appropriate time when there is a sensible and stable economic and social terrain on which to do it. He will also know that the courts do have discretion to prioritise the cases before them. He will also know that if landlords do not provide the right information to the courts in pursuit of their Section 21 application, the courts have the discretion to adjourn the case and push it to the end of the queue. And I'm quite sure that Sir Terence Etherington and Mr Justice Knowles will look very carefully at those landlords that fail to comply with their duties. Our approach has always been, Mr Speaker, to be fair to those that have lost out as a result of the epidemic, and also to be fair to landlords, particularly smaller landlords, who need their incomes.
The Everyone In programme has had unprecedented success
in bringing rough sleepers off the street. So will the Minister assure the House that the Government will do everything it can to build on this success, to engage with rough sleepers, to get them into long-term stable accommodation with support to grapple with the problems faced in terms of substance addiction, mental health issues and others which contribute to the causes of rough sleeping in the first place?
Mr. Speaker, I'm obliged to my right honourable friend, who is a doughty campaigner for her constituents in Chipping Barnet. I quite agree that we need to build upon the programme that she mentions. That's why I think on the 18th of July we announced the Next Steps accommodation programme, which I referred to earlier, Mr. Speaker, which has spent at that particular point something like £263 million on 3,000 homes to help the long-term homeless. Dame Louise Casey is tasked with making sure that we get people off the streets and keep them off the streets. And as a result of the measures that we have undertaken, something like 90% of those homeless at the start of the epidemic are now housed. We will continue to discharge our obligations, Mr. Speaker, and that's why on the 17th of September we announced further funds to the tune of, I think, £93 million to support the sorts of programmes to which my right honourable friend refers.
Rachel Basco.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. York has one of the highest levels of private rent on average in the country, and yet we know so many people are falling into rent arrears, and we know that we don't have any capacity in our social housing provision. In fact, the waiting list has gone up 300, over 20% that is, over the last 6 months. So how will he ensure local authorities like mine have sufficient resources in their discretionary grant in order to support my constituents and stop them becoming homeless?
I'm obliged, Mr. Speaker, for the honourable lady's question. As I've already described to the House, we have disbursed £180 million in discretionary housing payments to local authorities to support them, support those in difficulty. We have spent several £billion already on supporting local authorities through this pandemic, and we'll keep our proposals under review to ensure that we help everybody that is affected by this crisis, including her constituents in York. I would also say, Mr. Speaker, that my right honourable friend, the Chancellor's measures, which have been described by the Shadow Chancellor as a lifeline, and my honourable friend, the Work and Pension Minister's measures, which to date have injected a further £9.3 billion into our welfare safety net, are designed to do exactly what we want to do: keep people off the streets, keep them in their homes, keep them in their jobs, keep them as we move through this crisis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government took really excellent, strong steps to get rough sleepers off the streets during the first wave of the pandemic. And my right honourable friend might recall that I, together with the noble Lord Bird from the other place, who was the founder of The Big Issue, wrote with some suggestions on how we could continue to ensure that rough sleeping becomes a thing of the past. But now, of course, with the end of the moratorium on evictions fast approaching, the risk of people losing their work and then their home is increasing. So will my right honourable friend agree to look at some of the excellent and very practical proposals of the Ride Out Recession Alliance being proposed by the founders of The Big Issue, and consider taking up some of those to prevent joblessness becoming homelessness yet again?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've already described the package of measures that we've introduced. We have extended the notice period that landlords are required to give their tenants to 6 months. That means that tenants will not have to leave their homes over Christmas. And we've also made it clear that over the Christmas period, and also in areas of lockdown, there will be no evictions between the 11th of December, Mr. Speaker, and the 11th of January. There will be no eviction. So I think we've taken some of the steps that my right honourable friend has described. I'm always prepared to look at ideas, particularly if they're supplied to me by my right honourable friend.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I have to say, I find it incomprehensible that the Minister has not taken the opportunity to cut the Gordian knot and deal with Section 21 and the need to protect decent, honest tenants who are facing the loss not only of their job but also their home. But there is another, smaller group of antisocial tenants who are ruining the lives of their neighbours by their behaviour and seem to think that at the moment that they are untouchable. So will the Minister ensure that councils and the courts have the power and the capacity and are fully aware of this to take action against antisocial tenants and fast?
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for the points which he made, which I think are apposite ones. The House will know that it is for the courts to determine the priorities of their cases, but I'm sure that the House will be reassured to know that the courts will prioritise cases based upon matters like antisocial behaviour, fraud, domestic violence and the like. As a result of the statutory instrument that we laid on the 29th of August, it will be possible for landlords seeking possession of property because of the antisocial behaviour of their tenants to move much more quickly than the present rules or the former rules allowed, and they will be able to seek possession of their properties in 4 weeks. I think that's the right balance of fairness between those tenants who fall into difficulty because of no fault of their own and those tenants who abuse their rights and privileges, and the court should take action against them.
Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is right that the government brought about a moratorium on evictions, but it's also right that landlords' legal rights can once again be enforced. Can I ask my right honourable friend if he can share details with the House of the level of unpaid rent in the private sector and what support he is giving to those individuals who rely on rental income as their only income?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I understand from my discussions with the National and Residential Landlords Association that something like 89% of tenants are paying their full rent. Something like another 4% of tenants have agreed either rent holidays or rent reductions with their landlords, and something like 7% are in arrears. He's right to point out that smaller landlords rely upon their rents, and that is why we have made it plain through our introduction of the SI on the 29th of August that where there are egregious rents, then landlords should be able to move quickly to repossess their properties and rent them out again, because if they don't, the likelihood is that the number of properties available to rent will fall away as landlords leave the sector, and 21% of homes, as I said, Mr. Speaker, are in the private rented sector. It's an important part of our economy and we will support it.
Thank you. Newcastle Citizens Advice reports a massive jump in housing queries, and no wonder. After their family's health and well-being, their home is what's most important to most people, and the two are often related because we know that COVID-19 feeds off bad housing and overcrowding and the conditions like respiratory conditions associated with that. So he's giving a lot of general reassurances, but can he say to me specifically that no one in Newcastle will face either eviction, court action or bailiff action as a consequence of arrears due to COVID-19?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady has heard very clearly the measures that I have laid out to support tenants who find themselves in difficulty. Those tenants that have not paid their rents for more than 6 months, which predates the COVID emergency, may well find themselves in receipt of a notice from their landlords, and that notice to move will be much more quick. That seems to me to be a fair balance between protecting those people who have got into difficulty through no fault of their own, which is why we've extended the notice period that landlords have to give other tenants, and protecting landlords and the neighbours of antisocial tenants or tenants that are not paying their rents and haven't been paying them for some time, so that we protect those people who are doing the right thing. We also protect landlords who also want to do the right thing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the confirmation that as eviction hearings resume, cases of antisocial behaviour will be prioritised. But following on from the honourable gentleman's question, can the Minister confirm that my constituents suffering from this blight will now only have to wait 4 weeks before being put out of their misery?
I can confirm, Mr. Speaker, to my honourable friend, that those neighbours of antisocial tenants will find that their landlords are able to move much more quickly now to seek justice, to seek repossession of their properties and ensure that that sort of behaviour is stymied.
We now come to Karen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Housing advisors are reporting a surge in illegal evictions, and indeed I've had experience of this myself. Does the government recognise those figures? Does the government collect data on illegal evictions? Is the government expecting illegal evictions to continue to rise during the coming months? And when was the last time that guidance was issued to police forces across the country as to what their duties are to intervene in these cases?
Mr. Speaker, the law is quite clear, and I would advise and encourage all landlords to adhere to it. Those that don't may find themselves in receipt of a very dim view from the courts. Of the 7% of tenants who are in arrears, I am told that something like 1% of that body have received notices to evict. So landlords on the whole are doing the right thing. Those that are not, I hope, will be pursued by the law, because we need to make sure that landlords do the right thing, and illegal evictions of the sort that she notes are not tolerated in any way.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know that the government is desperately trying to be fair, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and this is an absolutely clear example. My casework is full of landlords complaining about tenants who are working but have refused to pay their rent, who are behaving antisocially. But isn't antisocial behaviour rather a broad catch-all? And what guidance can he ensure that both landlords and tenants get, so that then when they go to court, justice is done as he wishes?
I'm obliged, Mr. Speaker, to my honourable friend. The advice that we have given to renters and to landlords is published on gov.uk. He can take advantage of his technological know-how to take a look at it, and we keep it under constant review and revise it as necessary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Urgent action is needed to strengthen support for tenants struggling to pay their rent. Many have joined us in calling for the UK Government to lift local housing allowance rates further to cover average rents. Has he discussed this call with DWP and Treasury Ministers, and if not, why not?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we keep, as I say, our policies on the constant review, and I certainly talk to my honourable friend, the Work and Pensions Minister. We've increased the local housing allowance to the 30th percentile of local market rents. That was actually called for last year by Crisis and by Shelter. So we have been listening to our stakeholders in this area who are concerned about the effect on tenants. As a result of that intervention, we've increased tenants' incomes by something like £600 a year to help them through this crisis.
Buchan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend confirm that this government has made available an extra £9.3 billion in welfare support, including a more generous local housing allowance to help renters like those in my constituencies to pay their rent?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I can. My honourable friend is a hardy campaigner for her constituents. When I last came to the House before the recess to answer a similar urgent question, I told the House that we had injected into the welfare system something like £6.5 billion of further investment to help people in difficulty. I can now report to the House, as she has just pointed out, that we have now spent £9.3 billion on the welfare system. That is a very tangible example of the investment that we're putting in to help out people during this crisis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Young people have been hit hardest by the coronavirus jobs crisis and receive less local housing allowance. And as a consequence, 100,000 young people now are at risk of eviction. So can I ask the Minister what discussions he's had with youth organisations working with young people who are homeless, at risk of homelessness or perhaps sofa surfing, to ensure that young people do not face an evictions crisis? Yeah.
Well, it's a good point that the Honourable Lady makes. My department and my officials are in regular contact with a large number of stakeholders and groups concerned with those affected by this crisis. I myself have taken part in a large number of roundtables with various interlocutors. We will keep our policies under review, as I said, to deal with the challenges that people face. But I'd simply point her again to the interventions that we've already taken, including the job retention scheme, including the help with local housing allowance, including discretionary housing payments that have been dispersed to local authorities to help people in difficulty, including young people.
Alexander Stafford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will know that a large number of homeless people and those facing eviction are veterans. And although there are many good charities out there working to help homeless veterans, such as Help for Homeless Veterans, led by Stephen Bentham Bates, operating South Yorkshire, what support will he and his department offer to those men and women, our heroes, who are facing evictions, and what support can he give them?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, the member for the Rother Valley, for that question. He will know that anybody that has been a regular member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces will receive priority treatment by local authorities when it comes to housing and housing need. I certainly commend the work of Help for Homeless Veterans, led by the Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Stephen Bentham Bates, in his constituency, and I wish them more power to their elbow and more power to his.
Anderson.
Mr. Speaker, in my constituency of Putney, universal credit and job seeker allowance claimants have more than doubled since the lockdown. Almost a third of employees have been furloughed and a third of households in Putney are rented privately. With the evictions ban ending last weekend, furlough ending coming up very soon, and yesterday 6 months more of restrictions announced, does the Minister agree that this is the perfect storm, and will he now end Section 1 no-fault evictions?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend, the member for Colchester, has, with his department, increased welfare spending by £9.3 billion since this crisis began. That is helping millions of people who, through no fault of their own, are in need of universal credit. The Chancellor has introduced the job retention scheme and the furlough scheme, which has resulted in us spending something like £35 billion to help 9 million people. So we've taken very, very tangible steps to help people through this difficulty. We will continue to keep all of our policies under review as the epidemic develops. It has some way to go yet, and we shall be watching and reacting as appropriate.
The constituents are in the rented sector, and they have appreciated the last six months' worth of a moratorium. But, Mr. Speaker, can I just bring my honourable friend back to an answer that he gave some moments ago? Can he just confirm that for an area like mine, like Sandwell, which is currently under local restrictions, there will not be any evictions during those local restriction periods?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is correct. My right honourable friend, the Lord Chancellor, wrote to the Bailiffs Association to give them very clear direction as to their duties and responsibilities in lockdown areas in this crisis. Whilst there is a lockdown where movements are restricted, no evictions will take place.
Beth Winter.
And can I just say, I'd be more than happy to meet with the Minister to discuss the forward plan in Wales, which has been in the public domain since last week. So if you want to take me up on that offer, please do. Hundreds of thousands of people already in rent arrears and millions more at risk in coming months. It's imperative that we prevent evictions and ensure that people are safe and secure in their homes. Does the Minister agree that increasing the local housing allowance, as my Welsh colleagues have asked, to the 50th percentile is the most effective way to achieve this outcome?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said in answer to a question earlier, we have increased the LHA. We did it in response to a call from Crisis and from Shelter. We are listening. As I said, Mr. Speaker, that will result in £600 of additional income to people in difficulty. The best thing that we can do is to help people to pay their rents. That helps. That also means, Mr. Speaker, keeping people in jobs. And our primary focus as we work through this public health crisis is to keep the economy moving, keep people in jobs, ensuring that people can pay their bills.
Gary Sandbrook.
Mr. Speaker, the government was absolutely right to protect renters over the last 6 months, but unfortunately some people have misused that protection by causing unnecessary levels of antisocial behaviour in streets, and law-abiding citizens have had to put up with that. So does he agree with me that this is one step, is the right time now to lift the ban so that people can go back to a good quality of life in their streets and not have to put up with antisocial behaviour?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his question. The police have powers under the Antisocial Behaviour Act 2014 to deal with egregious antisocial behaviour, but he's absolutely right. Where tenants are behaving irresponsibly, are abusing their privileges and abusing their neighbours, then not just the police, but landlords and the courts should have the right to act swiftly, and that is the power that we've given them.
25 withdrawn. Robbie Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know that many of my constituents have warmly welcomed the evictions ban as they have faced severe financial difficulties as a result of the pandemic. So can my right honourable friend confirm that landlords will still be required to take into account coronavirus issues when starting eviction proceedings?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is absolutely correct. If a landlord wishes to pursue an action through the courts, that landlord will have to give the courts clear and defined information about the status of the tenant and the way the COVID-19 emergency has affected them. If any landlord fails to do so or attempts to circumvent those rules, then the courts can adjourn the case, pushing it to the end of the queue, which will cost the landlord, if nothing else, probably quite a bit of money. So we've made sure that there are tenant protections in place as we move through this crisis.
Charlotte Nichols.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As of yesterday, Warrington North is subject to local lockdown. The government has announced that bailiffs won't evict in areas under local lockdown, but the eviction ban has been lifted and the guidance for bailiffs remains unpublished. Given that local lockdown guidance does not clearly rule out bailiff actions, what assurances can the Minister give constituents of mine in the private rented sector are anxious about losing their homes as we stand on the precipice of a second wave of this pandemic?
Mr. Speaker, as I said in a previous answer, my right honourable friend, the Lord Chancellor, has written to the Bailiffs Association to make absolutely clear what their responsibilities are. Further guidance will be published in due course, but we are absolutely clear where there is a lockdown, where movement restrictions are in place, evictions should not take place. My right honourable friend, the Lord Chancellor, has made it clear in his letter. I make it clear from the dispatch box.
Jonathan Gillis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In Stoke-on-Trent, North Kidsgrove and Torque, I have a constituent who lives with her disabled son in private rented accommodation. She has recently been served a Section 21 notice and has until the 9th of November to find alternative specialist accommodation in a competitive marketplace. Will my honourable friend be able to advise me on how we can best assist those who need that specialist accommodation?
Mr. Speaker, I made it clear in my previous answers the work that we are doing with the Next Steps accommodation programme to the tune of £263 million. I'm not aware of the exact circumstances of his constituents, so it's probably better if he writes to me with more detail, and I'll be sure to follow it up.
We now come to Lloyd Russell Moyle.
Ministers will know from my interventions and interests in this place that I'm not an enemy of the landlord, but it does seem to me that the balance here is totally wrong. Landlords and homeowners have been able to have mortgage deferrals. They can't be repossessed without the court looking at circumstance and without the mortgage company discussing payment options. So why on earth does the Minister think it is acceptable for courts to have no discretion on Section 8 grounds on rent arrears? And when will he fulfil his manifesto pledge to get rid of Section 28 and introduce the Renters' Rights Bill?
Well, Mr. Speaker, given what the Honourable Gentleman sometimes says in this place and on social media, one might be forgiven for thinking he's the enemy of everybody some of the time. But in answer to his specific question about Section 21, we will reform the Section 21 of the 1988 Housing Act when we bring forward the Renters Reform Bill, which we will do in due course.
Sir Lane Saxby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Especially throughout this pandemic, it is crucial that we ensure the most vulnerable in society are supported. Is it not also the case we recognise that not every tenant is unable to pay their rent? And where necessary, shouldn't we be supporting those landlords who rely on the income from their rental properties to live on or have mortgages of their own to pay?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend, the member for North Devon, is absolutely right. Tenants should continue to pay their rents where they can, and where they can but won't, we have changed the 2020 Coronavirus Act to make it easier for landlords to act. We think we've struck a fair balance between the rights of tenants and the rights of landlords, and I would ask the House to support it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The end of the moratorium on eviction strikes fear in my heart, and I think it should strike fear in most members' hearts, because we know what's coming for so many families with children in our constituency who've done nothing wrong but are at the end of Section 21 evictions. My local authority, the London Borough of Merton, has had 24 two-bedroom properties available since the 1st of April. That's less than one a week. They have had 6 three-bedroom properties available. That is one a month. The families who are going to be evicted over the next few months face years in temporary accommodation. What support is the Minister giving to local councils to ensure that the temporary accommodation they find, which will be long-term in anybody's imagination, is fit for them and allows them to remain in their jobs, in their schools and close to their support networks?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have invested a great deal of money in local authorities throughout this crisis, as I think the Honourable Lady knows. I described to her the accommodation programme, which invests £263 million in 3,000 units for long-term homeless to be housed. We've just announced an affordable homes programme, which will result in something like 180,000 affordable homes being built over the next cycle, about half of those for discounted rent. I would encourage her to also take up her concerns with the Mayor of London to make sure he's building out the right number of homes that he's pledged to do and has thus far failed to do.
We now come to Andy Carter.
Mr. Speaker, as the Minister will know, a number of new restrictions were introduced in Warrington South, my constituency, earlier this week to try and bring down the spread of COVID. I've received a number of emails from concerned constituents that they may be at risk of eviction. Can my right honourable friend give assurances that no evictions are going to take place in areas like Warrington where local restrictions are in force?
Mr. Speaker, I commend my honourable friend for campaigning on behalf of his constituents in Warrington, and I can give him that assurance. Where there is a local lockdown, where movement restrictions are in place, no evictions will take place.
We now have 33 and 34 withdrawn, so we go to Neil Coyle.
The government is reintroducing evictions at the same time as scrapping employment support for millions of people, making it highly likely we'll see a very bleak rise in homelessness. Is the Minister aware that due to COVID regulations, many hostels and shelters cannot open to support homeless people this winter? And is his intention to resource alternative provision or revise those regulations?
Well, we have, Mr. Speaker, provided a great deal of resources for local authorities and for charities to support people through this emergency. We will continue to keep those policies and programmes under review, and if the Honourable Gentleman has specific ideas that he wishes to suggest, I'm happy to hear them.
Kevin Holland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to draw the House's attention to my register of members' interests. It's absolutely right that we're fair to tenants affected by the COVID crisis, and I think the Honourable Gentleman who tabled the urgent question is right to say we might consider to give the courts discretion over the nature of arrears. But it's also got to be right that we're fair to the neighbours of those guilty of antisocial behaviour, fair to those affected by domestic abuse, fair to landlords who are affected by arrears pre-COVID, and that should be the immediate focus of the court's attentions.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend, as ever, puts the point very eloquently, and I'm sure that Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service will have listened to him carefully.
We're heading to South London with Vicky Foxcroft. Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Nicola, is a key worker. In May, her landlord served her with a Section 21 no-fault eviction notice, giving her 3 months to move out. Housing benefit will only cover a one-bed flat for Nicola and her 2 teenage daughters. Letting agents demand an above-average income and the details of someone who earns more than £50,000 to guarantee the rent. What does the Minister suggest to people in Nicola's position do to provide a suitable home for their families during the pandemic?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've outlined to the House the range of measures that the government has undertaken to support renters during this crisis. I don't know the specific circumstances that Nicola finds herself in, although the Honourable Lady has outlined some of them. If she cares to write to me with further information, I will give her a full and considered response.
38 withdrawn, so we're going to remain in South London with Florence Eshalomi. Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many renters in my constituency of Vauxhall work in the leisure, hospitality and the creative sector. And now with these new restrictions coming in, they're going to continue to see a big shock in their income. The Prime Minister announced these new restrictions and they may be in place for another 6 months, but these measures have not been matched by any support for those renters. Will the Minister reintroduce the evictions memorandum whilst these restrictions are still in place and scrap the benefits cap, which is impacting tenants and those who are falling into rent arrears?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the benefits cap, from which there are right and proper exemptions, means that even with it, I think in London, there is an equivalent income of £28,000 for a person in receipt of it. We keep our policies under constant review. My honourable friend, the member for Colchester, is here listening to the points that the House is making. And of course, if we do choose to make future changes, we'll bring those to the House.
Final question, Craig.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have information on dozens and dozens of small-scale landlords, not property tycoons, who are now owed several thousands of pounds in rent arrears, some due to genuine hardship, whilst some from tenants taking advantage of the current situation. This situation is now causing some landlords, particularly those with mortgages, severe hardship. I know my right honourable friend has said that the best option is to give the tenant as many options as possible to pay their rent, so will he look at the development of interest-free government-guaranteed hardship loans for tenants to pay off their COVID arrears?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we will keep, as I said, our policies under review to make sure that they take account of the state of the emergency at any particular given time. The steps that we've already taken, including mortgage holidays and the right to extend those mortgage holidays, also apply to landlords. I'm very happy to keep in touch with my honourable friend as we continue to keep our policies under review to make sure he is apprised of the steps that we are taking to support landlords and tenants alike.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order.
Order. Order. I call Minister Michael Gove to make a statement.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. With your permission, I'd like to make a statement on preparations for the end of the transition period. There are now just 100 days to go until the United Kingdom leaves the single market and the customs union. And this will be a moment of great opportunity, but also of significant change and challenge. It's vital that we all take the steps required to grasp those opportunities and to meet and master those challenges. The government is of course committed to negotiating a new free trade agreement with the EU before the end of the transition period, and those talks are progressing. But whatever the outcome of those negotiations, things will change for businesses and individuals as they trade with and travel to the EU. It is important that we as parliamentarians all understand that and that we all take action to prepare. Whether we secure a good FTA before January or not, whether we get a Canada-style deal or exit on Australian terms, we will have left the single market and the customs union. And that fact means adjustments for businesses trading with the EU, changes for citizens travelling to the EU, and of course new responsibilities for government in both scenarios. The superb civil servants at Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs and their colleagues across government are working with business to ensure that exporters and importers are ready for new rules. Every business trading with Europe will need to thoroughly familiarise itself with new customs procedures, and whether they develop the capacity in-house or work with a customs intermediary, enhanced preparation is vital. The government's invested in increasing custom agents' capacity, it's supported growth in the sector, and of course it stands ready to do more. And HMRC are also able to support businesses to secure the AEO, or consignor and consignee status, which eases the flow of goods. Businesses which are fully ready for life outside the customs union will also, of course, be better prepared for the growing number of export opportunities outside Europe, as the UK establishes new trade relationships with partners across the globe, following the highly successful conclusion of our new trade deal with Japan. And because preparing for customs procedures will be required with or without a free trade agreement, these adjustments can't, of course, be left until the last minute. More and more businesses are becoming fully prepared, but there are still many who've not quite taken the steps they need to. Our survey evidence indicates that while 78% of businesses have taken steps, just 24% believe that they're fully ready. Indeed, 43% of businesses actually believe the transition period will be extended, even though the deadline for any extension has now long passed, and the date that we leave the single market and the customs union is fixed in law and supported across this House. Now, this government's taking action to prepare for that date, with the EXO committee, the Cabinet Committee charged with preparations for the end of the transition period, now meeting almost daily, taking decisions on trader and hauler readiness, border infrastructure and fisheries protection. The committee has now met 136 times since it was established, and it will continue to meet to make sure that we've taken all the steps required to prepare. But we also need businesses to prepare. The consequences of a lack of business preparedness will be not just economic opportunities missed for those companies who don't prepare, but potentially much wider disruption. That's why today we're publishing our reasonable worst-case scenario planning assumptions, indicating what could happen if we don't all secure improved preparedness. I should stress that this is not a prediction or a forecast, it's just a prudent exercise in setting out what could, in the worst circumstances, occur if we don't improve preparedness. And of course, if our neighbours decline to be pragmatic. The scenario builds on an estimate that only 50 to 70% of large businesses and just 20 to 40% of small and medium-sized enterprises would be ready for the strict application of new EU requirements. In those circumstances, that could mean that only between 30 and 60% of laden HGVs would arrive at the border with the necessary formalities completed for the goods on board. They'd therefore be turned back by the French border authorities, clogging the Dover to Calais crossing. In that scenario, flows across the critical short-stake crossings could be reduced by up to 60 to 80% compared to the normal rate, and in such circumstance, that could lead to queues of up to 7,000 HGVs in Kent. These queues and the associated disruption and delay would of course subside, as unready businesses who had their goods turned back at the French border would not want to repeat the experience. But it is clearly far better that everyone is aware now of what is needed to prepare, rather than to face additional disruption next year. And that's why we're publishing our reasonable worst-case scenario today. not just because any prudent government always prepares contingency plans for the worst, but also to illustrate the costs of a lack of preparedness while there is still plenty of time to prepare. This government's committed to doing whatever it takes to help business, and we've brought in a comprehensive series of measures to help businesses and individuals adapt to the changes ahead. We're helping businesses which import by introducing new border controls on imports in stages, and full controls will only be imposed from July of next year. We've produced a comprehensive border operating model, which provides a simplified guide, complemented by the work of gov.uk for business, and we'll be publishing an updated version with more granular detail in coming weeks. We've invested £705 million in new technology, infrastructure and jobs at the border. And we're ensuring extra personnel. Border Force have recruited more than 1,000 additional staff, with hundreds more being recruited now. And we've also made available more than £80 million in grants for organisations to recruit and train new customs agents to support an expanded customs intermediary sector. And of course, a new network of information and advice sites will help ensure that hauliers are up to speed with their new requirements and the correct paperwork. And of course, they'll be able to check their documentation as export ready using the new Smart Freight web portal. And of course, we've complemented all this activity with a public information campaign to help businesses prepare. The campaign communicates the actions that all businesses need to take before the end of the transition period, and there's a user-friendly checker tool on the gov.uk/transition page which details exactly what businesses need to do. Now, the government's taking all these steps to help business prepare because change requires preparation. But change is what the British people voted for. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, outside the single market and the customs union, the UK can exercise all the freedoms and flexibilities of a truly sovereign state. Outside the common agricultural policy, we can support our farmers better and enhance our natural environment. Outside the common fisheries policy, we can revive our coastal communities and improve our marine environment. We can strike new trade deals, which help developing nations grow faster and lower prices for consumers. We can develop tailored policies to better support new technologies and to level up our economy. We can invest the money that we currently send to Brussels in the NHS, in our science base, and in improving productivity in all the nations of the United Kingdom. We can develop free ports, which bring investment to overlooked communities. We can regulate more smartly, legislate more accountably, and strengthen our democracy. These are great prizes, and the British people voted in the 2016 referendum and the 2019 general election to make sure they were delivered. This government is committed to honouring those democratic choices, and I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Minister Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and to the Right Honourable Gentleman for advance sight of his statement this afternoon. The news today that there could soon be tailbacks of 7,000 lorries in Kent is quite extraordinary. I know the government has said that they are committed to building new infrastructure, but I didn't realise it meant concreting over the Garden of England. Today's warnings are based on a reasonable worst-case scenario. But given we have a reasonable worst-case government, we have to assume that these scenarios could play out quite soon. Looking at the letter to the road haulage industry, the government says that business should get ready. But what, Madam Deputy Speaker, about the government? There is a long list of promises for future in the letter. The UK government will be contacting haulage companies. They will be running targeted advertising. They will be publishing an updated haulier handbook. And they will launch advice stands at UK service stations. Madam Deputy Speaker, why aren't these essential prerequisites for a smooth transition not already here? It is all well and good to tell businesses to act now, but without the systems in place, frankly, it's like telling me to bake a cake, but forgetting to turn the oven on. Sectors from farming to haulage to car manufacturing are crying out for the government to get this right. These sectors are the backbone of British industry and they are vital to our everyday economy. If we don't listen to these experts, we will lose exports. I met with the Road Haulage Association last week. They are tearing their hair out. They have since met government ministers, and they described that meeting as a washout. Frankly, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is not good enough. In the summer, I visited the proposed lorry park in Ashford, Kent, where construction had just begun. It was with some dismay that I later read that workmen had encountered a Saxon brick wall in their excavations. I hope, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this is not a metaphor, but can the Minister assure the House that progress here is on track? Another site apparently earmarked is in Ebbsfleet. It is currently a COVID testing centre. With a test, trace and isolate system on its knees, this would be farcical if it was not so serious. Is it really too much to ask from ministers a little bit of joined-up government? On the 4th of September, the government granted itself the power to build additional lorry parks in 29 local authority areas without consulting residents. Can the Minister tell us exactly where these facilities will be? It is the least that local people deserve. Will the Minister tell the House how many customs agents and intermediaries are trained and in place? This is so important for the system to work. In the summer, the government admitted that there would be £7 billion worth of additional bureaucracy for UK businesses. It is the last thing they need right now. So is this still the most accurate assessment on the costs for businesses? It has been estimated that 10 new IT systems will be needed to make our new trading relationship with the European Union work. Can the Minister list those IT systems and guarantee that they will be in place and fully operational on the 1st of January? Given, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we were promised a contact tracing app, first of all in May, and then in June, and then in July, and that it is now September, what assurance can the Minister give that this time the government will deliver that vital technology, and that it will be working, and that it will be delivered on time? Frankly, the government's track record does not inspire confidence. Madam Deputy Speaker, we just have 100 days until the end of the transitions period. Labour's message to both sides in this negotiation is clear. Stop the posturing and start negotiating. It is in our national interest, it is in all our interests, that the government get a deal and they get it soon so that business do have time to prepare. The Conservatives have had 3 Prime Ministers and 4 years since the referendum in 2016. We've seen serial incompetence and countless U-turns. I say to ministers, get a grip on preparations and get a grip now. The transition period comes to an end on the 31st of December. Can the Minister guarantee, not just to this House, but to the whole country, that we will be ready?
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for her questions. She makes the point that there have been 3 Prime Ministers and 4 years since the referendum, and she alleges that there have been some U-turns. Well, this government's been consistent in its determination to honour that referendum result. If we're thinking of U-turns, then I think of the Labour Party, which at different times has been in favour of a referendum, in favour of extending the transition period, against our exit from the EU, and now seems to be resolutely in favour. I'm grateful that the Labour Party has now taken a decision to recognise that democratic verdict in 2016, but I think all of us, when we're reflecting on U-turns, flip-flops and changes of position, should exercise appropriate humility. Anyway, let me turn to the specific points. The Honourable Lady asked, of course, about what was required to do in order to prepare. And she made the point that, of course, we will be stepping up our intensive cooperation with business. But it was the case that the Chief Executive of the Port of Dover, when he appeared in front of the Future Relationship with the European Union Select Committee in June of this year, made it clear that it was possible at that point for any business to know exactly what was required, from the acquisition of a NIORI number to securing a customs intermediary or having in-house capacity. Everyone knew at that stage what would be required on our departure from the customs union and from the single market. So that information is there, and of course one of the things that we want to do is to make sure that more and more businesses, including those who think that the transition period will be extended, realise, as the Honourable Lady quite rightly pointed out, that there is no turning back from this date and that we need all to be ready by the 1st of January. The Honourable Lady asked about our determination to secure a deal. We're absolutely determined to do everything that we can to secure a deal, but one of the purposes of this statement today is to underline that whether or not we secure a deal, because we're leaving the single market and the customs union, there are some activities that all businesses must engage in. And I hope that members of Parliament across the House, whatever their views on the merits of our departure from the European Union, will work with the government in order to ensure that business is directed towards the information it needs and given the support that it deserves. The Honourable Lady also made a reference to her visit to Ashford, and I'm grateful to her and to others for drawing attention to the need for additional infrastructure at or near the border, and for the need for this government investment in order to make sure that we're ready. And of course, the Ashford Mojo site will be available to provide transit facilities for those who are exporting, and then from July 2021, it will also provide facilities for those who are importing as well. And I'm grateful to everyone who's played a part in making sure that that site will be ready on time. She referred to the Ebbsfleet site. The Ebbsfleet site had actually been acquired by HMRC some time ago in preparation for a potential no-deal exit before the withdrawal agreement was secured. It was then temporarily allowed to become a testing site. The testing facilities have now moved to another location in Kent, and Ebbsfleet, along with North Weald, is available as a transit site. It's important that this government, like all governments, ensures not only that we provide for the public health of our people, but also for the free flow of commerce. She also made reference to customs agents and intermediaries. The £80 million that has been provided is a sum that hasn't yet been fully drawn down, and I hope that our exchanges today will encourage businesses and others to ensure that they do have access to that money. And she also asked about IT systems. IT systems like IPAFs have been in place for some time now. That is the new IT system that will replace Traces, which is an EU system which, of course, we will no longer have access to. But there are other systems like Smart Freight and GVMS which are in operation and being tested with business now. It's vitally important that all of us recognise that, as I said earlier, business needs our support in order to navigate, to meet and master these challenges, and also to take advantage of these opportunities. And the government stands ready to work with everyone across this House of Commons in order to ensure that business is ready and at what is undoubtedly a difficult time for the economic life of our country, we all do what we can to help.
Damien Green.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I can assure my right honourable friend that the so-called Saxon wall on the Ashford site is in fact a myth. It's not Saxon and it's not holding up work. But the prospect of 7,000 trucks queuing to cross the channel will send a chill through my constituents, because we know what effect that has on all the roads in Kent, and it's disastrous. So I very much support my right honourable friend in his work to prepare the road haulage industry for the end of the transition period. But can I ask about the government's own preparations, and specifically the Smart Freight system, which he mentioned, which is essential for the smooth running of traffic across the channel? Can he give a guarantee that that system will be fully up and running and operational from January?
Well, my right honourable friend makes a number of very important points. I'm grateful for him clearing up the point about archaeology, which I failed to address in my response to the Honourable Lady, but his expertise in this area is greater. He's absolutely right. What we want to do is to avoid the level of congestion that this reasonable worst-case scenario sets out. And he's also absolutely right that that requires people to work together. Yes, it requires not just the haulage industry, but in particular those goods exporters who are committing goods to haulage to be ready in time. But part of that is the Smart Freight system. That system has been developed, it's being shared with business, and we want to make sure that people use a relatively simple process in order to get what will become known as a Kent Access Permit, which means that they can then proceed smoothly through Kent because they do have the material required. If they don't have the material required, then it will be the case that through policing, ANPR cameras and other means, we'll do our very best to ensure that his constituents are not inconvenienced.
We now go to the SNP spokesperson, Pete Wishart.
And thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. So today is the day where all the Brexit chickens come home to roost, only of course they won't, because they'll be sitting in a 7,000 strong lorry queue in a Kent motorway for 2 days waiting to be dispatched. And I remember the days of the easiest deal in history, having our cake and eating it while observing the sunny uplands, when even the Duchess himself told us that we hold all the cards. Well, it seems the only card we're holding is the Joker with his spitting image moosh all over the front of it. What I don't understand is, why does he continue with this charade of seeking a deal when we know it's the no deal that they all want and all covet? And can I tell him that the Scottish people are also scenario planning, but we're planning our best case scenario when we get out of rogue state UK before the worst of this Brexit madness consumes our beautiful nation. And his European counterparts must be looking forward to the next round of talks with all the relish of a vegan being served a platter of chlorinated chicken. And we're told that the talks are at a delicate stage. They're so delicate that the EU are close to telling the UK to go and get stuffed. And you have to say you could see their point. They're having to deal with a UK that's prepared to tear up the withdrawal agreement that was oven ready and the greatest deal ever just a few months ago, and in the process break international law. But there's one good thing that's come out of all of this, and that is it's focused Scottish minds on the type of future that we want. A future in rogue state UK with all the horrors of their low deal, no deal Brexit, or a future as a normal European nation, making our own decisions, free of this clown shoe government. As a famous son of Aberdeen, he must know which direction the Scottish people are travelling in.
Well, I don't know where to begin. Chickens, cakes, those questions are a mixed metaphors, the like of which even the most impressive Macca would be proud of. It was a remarkable, they usually are remarkable performances. Can I say thank you to the Right Honourable Gentleman for referring to the fact that Spitting Image have fashioned a rubber puppet in my likeness. It's one of the greatest honours that has ever been paid to me, and I hope that other members of the House will enjoy that recognition in due course. But to turn to his specific questions, he asks about chickens. One of the things that we will be doing, actually, is that we will be making sure that we prioritise day-old chicks and fish and shellfish from Scottish harbours in order to make sure that they reach the fish market in Boulogne without let or impediment, specifically because as we take back control of our waters and access to marine resources enables Scotland to get thousands of new jobs and millions in new investment, so we want to be able to take full advantage of that. And it is sadly one of the decisions that the Scottish Government have taken that they wish to re-enter the European Union, give up access to that bounty and to sell the coastal communities of Scotland short. And I think that I may gently suggest that that's probably a mistake as well. He makes the point that the best case scenario for Scotland is independence. That's long been his position. But of course, while we set out to answer questions in this House, there are many questions about independence that have not been answered. What will be the currency that an independent Scotland would use? How would UK pensions be guaranteed in an independent Scotland? What would the replacement for the furlough scheme in an independent Scotland be when the HM Treasury is no longer capable of providing that money? And as the Growth Commission of Andrew Wilson has pointed out, an independent Scotland would have to pay a premium for borrowing on international markets. So no pound, no pension and poorer, an independent Scotland, unless he can come up with better answers, is the worst case of all.
David Mundell.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I ask a question that actually matters in relation to jobs and the economy of Scotland? As my right honourable friend will be aware, with only 100 days to go to the end of the transition period, can he confirm that the UK Government has given up on the EU resolving the Airbus-Boeing dispute, which has led to very damaging tariffs on Scotch malt whisky in the US? And will the UK Government pursue a bilateral resolution of that dispute to see those tariffs lifted and enable the Secretary of State for International Development to negotiate a free trade agreement which sees such tariffs banished forever?
Honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this issue. It is because of the EU's mishandling of the Airbus project that the US imposed tariffs on malt whisky where they did not exist beforehand, hitting one of Scotland's most important exports. But the International Trade Secretary, my right honourable friend Liz Truss, has been directly negotiating on Scotland's behalf with the US to see these tariffs lifted. She's already secured progress on gin, and I hope that she will secure progress on whisky as well. And it is the case that the excellent Karen Betts, the Chief Executive of the Scotch Whisky Association, has of course been appointed explicitly as an advisor to the Secretary of State in order to help ensure that the UK Government, with its negotiating weight, can do for the Scots whisky industry what the EU was not capable of doing.
Select Committee Chair Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for his statement, although I think a queue of 7,000 lorries wouldn't be much of a great prize for the country. As he knows, for months now, those who move goods for a living across the short straits have been warning ministers that systems and training won't be ready in time. And now the industry says it is being fitted up to take the blame for the government's failure to grasp, in the words of one logistics expert involved in the talks, real-world complexities. Now, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster just told the House that the Goods Vehicle Movement Service and the Smart Freight IT systems are in operation. When did that happen?
Well, they have been developed. They are in operation now. We're refining with business exactly how they should operate for businesses' benefit.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. May I congratulate my right honourable friend on his spitting image puppet and the other literary prowess visited on him in recently published diaries this week. May I remind my right honourable friend of his considerable generosity in coming to attend in the West Midlands a round table with manufacturers some 12 months ago, which he did with our outstanding West Midlands Mayor, Andy Street. And will he, as he discharges his most important duties set out in his statement today, remember two of the points that were raised at that round table with him? The first is concern about just-in-time supply chains, and the second is the importance of removing tariffs on finished goods and components in those supply chains.
Well, I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. I wasn't aware that there were any diaries being published this week, but obviously I'll look out anxiously whenever I will look out anxiously when I next pass Waterstones and Camberley. But on the substantive point he makes, he's absolutely right. There's no better champion of the automotive sector than the West Midlands Combined Authority Mayor Andy Street. The roundtable that I had with him, the opportunity I've also had with Andy Street to visit JLR, to talk to Ralph Speth and others, has impressed upon me the vital importance of doing everything we can to support that sector on which so many jobs depend, and that is why we're so anxious to secure a deal.
Ben Lake.
Aware of the considerable concern that Welsh ports such as Fishguard and Holyhead will be severely impacted by any delays to the introduction of the goods vehicle management and smart freight systems. Could the Minister therefore tell the House what proportion of vehicles crossing the Irish Sea from Wales to Ireland he expects would face disruption under the government's reasonable worst case scenario?
Goods coming from Ireland to Wales should not face impediment because we're staging our processes in the way that I described. Goods going the other way, again, much depends on the determination made by EU member states about the processes that they will apply. But we are working with the Welsh Assembly Government, the Senedd, in order to invest in a facility near Holyhead in Anglesey in order to ensure that transit and other procedures can facilitate the flow of traffic and trade.
Sarah Brickcliffe.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The people of Harben and Haslingden voted overwhelmingly to leave the EU and for someone who would respect their decision, and yet they're still urging me to press the government not to extend the transition period. So can my right honourable friend confirm that the EU has accepted that we will not accept or seek an extension to the transition period, and that at the end of this year we will deliver on our promise to the British people and regain our economic and political independence?
Yes, no, my honourable friend makes absolutely the right point. The certainty of knowing that we will leave on that date and the publication of the information today, I hope will help business to prepare with certainty for the end of the transition period. And every Conservative Member of Parliament was elected on a manifesto making it clear that we would extend the transition period on the end the transition period on the 31st of December. One of the difficulties that we have in this House is that while the opposition front bench quite rightly support that position, Labour politicians in power, like the First Minister of Wales and the Mayor of London, take a very different position. And, you know, the leader of the Labour Party was talking yesterday about patriotism. One of the things that I think would be patriotic if he were to make it clear that Labour was united in backing the British people.
We now go to Fergal Clark.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government has promised its Shared Prosperity Fund to replace EU structural funding for regeneration and growth since 2017. Yet, despite originally promising a consultation, we haven't seen one. There haven't even been any engagement events since the Prime Minister took office. Madam Deputy Speaker, when will the Minister publish the framework through which the shared prosperity will work to keep it accountable and prevent pork barrel politics and bound to target seats?
Well, the Honourable Lady makes a very important point. It will be the Secretary of State at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government who will be outlining how the Shared Prosperity Fund will be distributed. But she's absolutely right. As a result of our departure from the European Union, we will have more money to spend on our priorities, and we will, of course, spend that money on what the Prime Minister has called the levelling up agenda. There are parts of our country, overlooked communities, undervalued families, neglected by Labour local authorities for far too long, that now have Conservative MPs in this place, and it is vitally important that their advocacy on behalf of their constituents to improve their productivity is supported, and that's why everything from new free ports to increased investment will go to those areas which have been neglected by Labour for far too long.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the figures that my right honourable friend has given today in terms of business preparedness for the 31st of December are concerning. Isn't the important advice that he's given today that those businesses should either do the paperwork themselves or they should go and get an intermediary to do it on their behalf?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right. We want to help and to support business. That's why we've provided the funding that we have. But one of the reasons for publishing the reasonable worst-case scenario today was to draw attention to the fact that if we don't all work together, then there will be disruption. But if we do work together, there are huge opportunities to be seized.
Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. 7,000 HGV lorries parked end to end would stretch from this building to Dover. That's the scale of the problem the Secretary of State is setting out. Where are the 29 extra lorry parks going to be? We need to know that. This is about government preparedness. His statement seems to be all about passing the blame onto business for the chaos being caused by his government.
No, the right honourable gentleman, in emphasising that figure, is helping. Because, of course, what we want to do is to avert that scenario. And as I pointed out, it is not a prediction, but it is a warning. And there is a responsibility, he's quite right, on government, and that's why we have invested in the sites in Ebbsfleet and in North Weald, in Ashford and elsewhere, including Warrington and the West Midlands. It's also the case that should there be specific areas of traffic management in Kent that we need to deal with, that steps have been taken with the Kent Resilience Forum to do just that. But the reason for publishing the scenario today is to seek to avert precisely that happening. And I hope that he'll work with businesses in his constituency in order to make sure that they let government know what more it is that they need in order to be ready.
Alan Cairns.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The most senior Labour politician in office in the UK is the Welsh First Minister. Now, he has called for the transition period to be extended beyond the end of the year. Now, some people see that as a way of avoiding or delaying Brexit. Now, I can advise my right honourable friend that the Welsh people voted in greater numbers than the average across the UK to leave the European Union. Can my right honourable friend therefore reassure me that the end of the year will be the end of the transition period?
Well, my right honourable friend makes a very important point. The result across the United Kingdom, because we voted as one United Kingdom, was clear, but it's also the case that support for leaving the European Union was very strong across Wales. I've got great respect for the First Minister of Wales, and we've worked well together in dealing with the COVID pandemic, but I do think that my right honourable friend is absolutely right. It would be sensible now for all politicians, rather than saying that the transition period should end and creating that illusory prospect that if we work together in order to prepare for the 31st of December.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much. The road haulage industry has been talked about much in this debate, and they did keep and have kept food on our shelves in supermarkets and medicines and in our pharmacies through the most recent crisis. The report says, and the statement says, that the government has put aside £80 million for customs agents. Can the House hear, please, how many agents do we have at the moment? How many will we need on the 1st of January? And how many will this training provide for the 1st of January to ensure that the haulage industry can keep operating?
Well, the Honourable Lady is absolutely right. The haulage industry has been doing a fantastic job, and I make no criticism the haulage industry or individual hauliers, quite the opposite. Most of the work that will be required by the companies which are exporting rather than the haulage industry, and it is they who will either hire customs intermediaries to do the work for them, or, as my right honourable friend pointed out, do that work in-house. Now, some of that work is being done in-house, some of it is done by major players, some by companies like Kuhn & Nagel, who are real experts in that area. The market is moving. The response that we've had from some of them is that, particularly in the last couple of weeks, there has been significantly greater call for their services, and they have been recruiting, but the £80 million that we have has not been entirely drawn down yet. And of course, we keep under review the amount that we are providing in order to ensure that if more is needed, more can be provided.
Ben Everett.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'm sure we're all aware that when we finally leave the transition period at the end of the year, we will also be leaving behind the Common Agricultural Policy, which has done such damage not only to agricultural economics but to our environment as well. Perhaps my right honourable friend could detail how the system that replaces it that we are preparing will be better for farmers, fairer, better for our agricultural economy, for our environment, and also support our target of net zero.
Well, my honourable friend makes a very important point, and as the DEFRA Secretary of State has pointed out, as we move away from the Common Agricultural Policy, we move to a system where farmers can be supported with public money to provide public goods, whether that's increasing the organic content of their soil or contributing to better and cleaner management of our waters. But it's also the case that as the recent trade deal that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for International Trade, has secured, we have improved market access for our superb produce to new markets.
Jim Shannon.
Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster for his statement today. Last Friday, I had the opportunity to meet Gordon's Pharmacy in Newton Ards and listen to these things. And as a type 2 diabetic, which I declare an interest, who listened to many saying insulin and other medications would not be able to be sourced post-Brexit, can the Chancellor tell me what progress has been made to ensure that the supply of medicines from the EU to the UK and then from GB mainland to Northern Ireland is smoothly continued after the transition period ends? Thank you.
The Honourable Gentleman raises a very, very important consideration because of the operation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And I was discussing with the Minister of State at the Department of Health and Social Care and also officials in the Northern Ireland office and other departments yesterday how we can make sure that the supply of medical goods continues uninterrupted to Northern Ireland. And he's quite right. One of the single most important is insulin because of the particular requirements that diabetics like he and indeed my father face.
Mary Robinson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful for the statement setting out the current position. During these uncertain times, it is vital that businesses have as much clarity as possible, especially the many businesses in Cheadle that rely on trade with the EU. In addition to the preparations my right honourable friend has outlined, we can give those businesses the certainty they deserve by agreeing a free trade deal with the EU this year. Can my right honourable friend therefore reassure my constituents that the government continues to work towards that prime objective?
Yes, absolutely. The government is absolutely committed to securing a Canada-style free trade agreement. One of the difficulties that we've had in the talks is that the European Union, as our negotiator David Frost has pointed out, still hasn't come to grips with the fact that we will be a sovereign equal, not in the size of our economy, but in our democratic mandate. And therefore, there are still one or two sticking points because they're seeking to tie us to their rules rather than recognising we will follow our own path. But I'm confident we can overcome those difficulties and secure a free trade agreement, which would be in everyone's interests. But of course, many of the preparations that business requires to undertake are the same whether or not we have an FTA or not.
Stephen Farry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Businesses in Northern Ireland and elsewhere urgently need to see the detail on the border operating model between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Previously, the Chancellor for the Duchy of Lancaster promised that would be published by the end of July. While it is desirable that we see the outcome of the Joint Committee and future relationship negotiations, they are not essential for this. So can he give a revised commitment as to when we're going to see that?
Yes, I mean, the Honourable Gentleman makes a very good point. The Joint Committee should, God willing, meet next Monday in Brussels. I'll be seeing Maros Šefčovič then as we seek to make progress in these matters. He will know that we made more than £200 million available through the Trader Support Service and Support for IT to help businesses in Northern Ireland. And indeed, even though it's been a subject of contention in this House, the provisions within the UK Internal Market Bill are there to make sure that Northern Ireland's businesses do have a guarantee that whatever happens, they will not be required to have export declarations when goods move from Northern Ireland to Great Britain, because the principle of unfettered access is so important.
Deputy Speaker, I welcome my right honourable friend's statement, and particularly the extra £705 million for infrastructure at our border. Would my right honourable friend be able to update us a little more on the technological solutions and how they're developing, such as the smart freight service, in order to facilitate movement across the borders?
I'm very, very grateful to the Honourable Lady for, my Honourable Friend, I should say, sorry, for making that point. Yes, there are a number of systems. So, for example, I mentioned earlier the IPAF system, which is critical for those in the agri-food sector, which has been developed for some time now. The Smart Freight system and the GVMS system are being operated within government at the moment in consultation with business, and we hope that they will go live so that they are there for all to see in their ideal form in the course of the next few weeks.
Daniel Zeigner.
Thank you. In just 100 days, all food exports to the EU will require an export health certificate and an authorised vet to sign that off. Do we have enough vets to do that? And also, I understand £80 million has been made available for the 50,000 custom agents required. Could we be told how much of the money has been drawn down and they're in place? And as a former IT person, can I ask him, is he really confident that the IT systems are going to be in place and working?
Three very good points. On the question of vets, yes, but there is a requirement on every part of the United Kingdom to play their part. So we've been talking with, for example, the Northern Ireland Executive about making sure that the specific need for vets in the new border control post in Northern Ireland is satisfied. It is the case that there are vets and others who can carry out this job across the UK. But I would say that, for example, I hope, fingers crossed, that the Scottish Government have provided enough money to Aberdeenshire Council in order to make sure that those who provide export health certificates and catch certificates in the harbours of Fraserburgh and Peterhead are in place. I don't think voters in either Fraserburgh or Peterhead would forgive the Scottish Government if they hadn't made that investment and had used the money elsewhere. I'm sure they wouldn't have done. On the point about IT, it is the case that we're working hard internally and with authoritative expertise to make sure that those IT systems will work. I don't think any of us can make a confident prediction that everything will always be perfect, but it is the case that some of the very, very best people in government and in the private sector are committed to making it work.
Joe Gideon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree that as we reach the end of the transition period, as well as seeking a positive future relationship with the European Union as a sovereign independent nation, we are well positioned to take advantage of new global opportunities? And will he join with me in congratulating advanced ceramics research company Lucidian in my constituency, which is set to receive a £1 million boost as a result of the new Japan trade deal that the UK and Japan have agreed in principle? Lucidian's joint venture with the Japanese partner will bring new jobs to Stoke-on-Trent Central, and plans for an advanced ceramics campus in North Staffordshire a step closer.
Well, I agree with my honourable friend. That is unmitigated good news. The ceramics sector is well placed to take advantage of new international trade deals, and it couldn't have a more effective champion than my honourable friend.
We now go to Sir Mark Hendrick.
Madam Deputy Speaker, with the end of the EU transition period fast approaching and our borders with the EU woefully ill-prepared for the trading arrangements a no-deal Brexit will bring, may I ask the Secretary of State how the £700 million he has announced will, over the 3 months he has available, recruit and retrain hundreds of new customs officers required to carry out border checks, and with so little time left to fully test, install and commission the smart infrastructure technology required to implement those checks. Isn't this just another example of what the whole of Brexit has been about? Wishful thinking and self-deception rather than the acceptance of the reality on the ground.
The first part of the honourable gentleman's question was, I think, very opposite. The £705 million that's being made available is being made available, of course, to ports and will also help pay for inland infrastructure. But I should stress that much of that infrastructure will only be required when we ourselves are imposing checks, which won't come until July of next year. But it's also the case that any individual member of this House who will be seeing infrastructure built in their constituency will be contacted, if they haven't already been, by my colleagues Lord Agnew and the Parliamentary Under-Secretary in my department, the member for Upminster.
Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The people of Newcastle-under-Lyme voted very clearly to leave the European Union. But contrary to the wild claims from the SNP spokesman earlier, they're not seeking a no deal. They want a good, fair, constructive deal negotiated in good faith with the EU. But they do want this over and done with. And so would he join me and them in rejecting the calls from the Labour Party for senior members such as the Welsh First Minister, such as the Mayor of London, to extend the transition period? We can't have that to happen, because if that happens, then that will only lead to more uncertainty for business. We need to move on.
My honourable friend makes absolutely an important point. We've set out a timetable. Sticking to that timetable will enable people, I hope, to take all of the steps required. And he makes the point that we don't seek, in this side of the House, no deal. Quite the opposite. We're keen to seek a deal. But one question that's never been answered is, if there were ever a vote for independence in Scotland, I'm sure there won't be ever, but if there were ever, the SNP have never made clear whether they would rely on there being a negotiated settlement or whether they would go for a no-deal Skexit as well. It's one of the many, many questions that the SNP decline to answer.
We now go to Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was listening very carefully to the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster about business preparedness, not least because it's only 3 months to the end of the transition period. Businesses in the food and drink industry in my constituency would love to be able to be ready for Brexit, but there's no guidance yet as to what labels businesses need to use to legally sell their goods in the EU and in Northern Ireland next year. When will the government announce these measures so that the food and drink manufacturers aren't held back from making the preparations they need?
The Honourable Gentleman makes a very important point. Some of that detail has already been published, but there is more that it depends on the negotiations. But if he wants to get the companies in his constituency that have particular concerns to get in touch with me direct, I'll work with him in order to provide them with the information that we have.
Sir Desmond Swain.
The Markets Bill doesn't break any law, does it?
This government believes entirely in the rule of law.
Patricia Gibson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, this UK government fought an election and won a majority in this House on the basis that it had an oven-ready Brexit. And in March last year, the Honourable Gentleman said, and I quote, "We did not vote to leave without a deal." Now we are staring down the barrel of a no-deal Brexit, the consequences of which will be magnified by the economic fallout from Brexit. What does he say? What does the Honourable Gentleman say to those who voted for his government on the basis that it had an oven-ready Brexit and now feel utterly betrayed?
Well, I haven't met anyone in that position. And the truth is that, of course, we left on the 31st of January. The one thing I do increasingly find are lots of people in Scotland who, the more they look at the position of the Scottish National Party and the Scottish Government, are becoming yes to no voters. And that's the growing trend I've observed.
Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I welcome my right honourable friend's statement. He will know that there are two important industries in the UK that begin with the letter F. One contributes 1.4 billion to the UK economy. The other contributes 132 billion and employs over 1 million people. So can I ask my right honourable friend, in his July statement, he committed the UK to upholding international norms so there is a free flow of capital and efficient markets. Is he convinced that he can still deliver those international norms so there is delegation? And is he convinced that there will be equivalence for UK financial services in July 2021?
I'm confident of that. One of the things about equivalence is that it is what's called an autonomous process within the EU. And I think since the Prime Minister drew attention to the slow progress of some of those autonomous processes, to be very fair to the EU, that has meant an acceleration. So I am confident, yes.
Justin Madders.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I don't think in response to earlier questions we've actually had clarity over how many customs agents are in place now. So can the Secretary of State provide us with that figure? And can he also guarantee that when the time comes, any business that needs the services of a customs agent will be able to access one?
Well, customs agents are provided by the market. And of course, it is the case that there are a number of customs intermediaries whose businesses are growing. There are a number of other businesses who will employ people in that role. And just as I cannot precisely state at any given time in a dynamic market how many people are doing exactly what job, what I can state is that the £80 million that we've made available has not yet been fully drawn down. But any company that is in this area will know that come the 1st of January, there will be an increased demand for their work. So this is an opportunity to expand, and the government stands ready to help that.
Brendan Clark-Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome this government's UK Internal Market Bill as we reach the end of the transition period and take back control? One of the issues that's been raised many times during the debates was the EU's refusal to give us third country listing. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that this third country listing is vital in agreeing a deal with the European Union? And can he assure me that he will continue to push to make them take reasonable steps to make sure this happens?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and the reluctance or the slow pace in granting third country status for food exports to the UK has been concerning, but thanks to the Prime Minister drawing attention to this issue, progress is being made.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Further to the question asked by the honourable gentleman for Wimbledon, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster will know that financial services firms in the UK generate a huge number of jobs, a not insignificant number of which are held by my constituents. So can he tell the House, therefore, exactly what progress has been made on the vital issue of achieving equivalence and what remains still to be sorted out?
Well, the honourable gentleman makes an important point. Equivalence is decided by the EU. It is an autonomous process separate from but occurring in parallel with the negotiations. And obviously, as I mentioned earlier, the Prime Minister having drawn attention to the slow pace in these processes, we have seen an acknowledgement of that on the side of the EU. But I should also say, obviously the EU is a sovereign equal, it will make its own decisions, but EU businesses having access to the broad and deep capital markets that we have in this country helps EU businesses, and if it was the case that they were to cut themselves off from our capital markets and our financial services, then the cost of their transactions would increase and their shareholders would lose out.
Richard Holden.
Madam Deputy Speaker, this government was elected with an overwhelming mandate to get Brexit done. In fact, substantially in order to ensure that their 2016 vote was respected, constituencies like mine and others across the blue wall returned Conservative MPs for the first time ever. Can my right honourable friend confirm that, in order that to give both businesses clarity and to respect the will of the people of North West Durham, there will be no extension to transition?
Yes, the honourable gentleman is a brilliant advocate for the people of Consett and the whole of his constituency, and there won't be an extension.
Chris Stevens.
Speaker, in the worst case scenario that the Secretary of State has outlined, on the basis of no employment bill, which the government committed to, and the European Union looking to strengthen workers' rights on zero-hour contract workers, agency workers and those workers susceptible to short-term shift changes, is the government still committed to at least matching employment protections of those of the European Union?
Hear, hear.
Good question from the honourable gentleman. I know he has a distinguished background in the trade union movement and elsewhere in defending workers' rights, and I'd like to pay tribute to his work in that area. And yes, we do want to ensure that we protect workers' rights, and we will always look at what the EU and other jurisdictions are doing to see where we can match and, where possible, exceed the protections offered.
Young.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I and many of my constituents want to see super trawlers banned from destroying our marine wildlife and damaging our fishing towns, something that we can't do while part of the EU. I know my right honourable friend has long been committed to support our fisheries as we leave the EU, so can he confirm that after December the 31st we will have the ability to stop foreign super trawlers operating in our seas, and at a time when our negotiations are at their fiercest, will he stand firm on our commitment to take back control of our waters?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. One of the benefits of departing from the EU is that we can safeguard our marine environment from predators, and so we will take all the steps necessary to do so.
Paula Lockhart.
Madam Deputy Speaker, 7,000 truck-long queues in Kent and 2-day delays to trade would be disastrous for UK businesses, but so too would any delays and queues as a consequence of imposed checks within the UK as a result of the repugnant NI protocol. What assurances can my right honourable friend give to me and businesses in Northern Ireland that no such delays will feature at Larne, and will he give an assurance to meet with me and the major agri-food sector businesses in the not too distant future?
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for raising that, and also for the opportunity I had to visit Ulster Carpets in her constituency over the course of the summer. And it is the case the Government's committed to making sure that the Northern Ireland Protocol operates in such a way as to not in any way disadvantage Northern Ireland's agri-food businesses, and I'd be delighted to meet them with her.
Sir Edward Lee.
Despite all these scare stories, surely there's no bar to a deal. We're not going to undercut the EU, surely, on state aid. We're not going to return to picking winners on all that rubbish. In terms of regulation of business, we're not going to create a bargain based in the economy. We're not going to produce rust buckets like the Morris Minor I drove to university with a hole in the floor in 1968. But there's breaking news just now that if the deal is conducted late, there indeed may not be an extension of the transition period, but there may be a 2-year implementation period. So what I'd like to have now from the Secretary of State is an absolute commitment, no extension to transition, no implementation period. We want a clean break, as we promised the electorate, at the end of this year.
Absolutely right.
Everything the Right Honourable Gentleman said, I completely agreed with. But apart from one thing, I can't believe that he went to university in 1968. He looks much younger than that.
Sion Wara.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And this morning I met with the North East Chamber of Commerce and local businesses, and we discussed the massive investment in technology and digital skills required by the pandemic to move processes, services and products online. Now they have another transition to face. So will he list each IT system which a business will have to interface with, and when it will be available to be tested by them so that they can begin the process of preparedness?
Yes, the border operating model, which we published earlier, outlines the IT systems. We published in July, outlines the IT systems with which business will interact, but of course we're augmenting and updating it, and it'll be published later this month.
We now go to Damien Collins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster accept that even this worst case scenario situation of 7,000 queuing lorries would be intolerable for people in Kent and in my constituency? Even if it was only half that bad, it would still require the closure of the coastbound M20. And can he assure us that he will do all he can to make sure that that is not the reality that people are confronted with next year?
My honourable friend makes a very, very good point. It's precisely because we want to avoid that scenario that we're sharing it today, in order that government can be held to account for doing everything possible to avoid that, and also so that we can work with business in order to avoid that. Now, we've got to be ready for the worst, but which is why we have taken appropriate contingency plans. But in order to avert that scenario, we want to work with my honourable friend and those in his constituency and businesses everywhere in order to ensure that we can be ready. And I have to say that Eurotunnel, of course, in his constituency have been brilliant in the support that they've been given the business sector as well.
Letter 7 withdrawn, so we go to Bill Wiggin.
Does my right honourable friend think the EU will lose in the event of no deal? And isn't this figure the sort of thing that is not helped by senior Labour politicians suggesting that we might extend the transition period? Yeah.
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely correct that no deal is in nobody's interests, and the fact that the First Minister of Wales or the Mayor of London are holding out the prospect of an extension of the transition period doesn't contribute to the concentration of minds, and to be fair to the Honourable Lady, the productive work required in order to secure a deal.
Alistair Carmichael.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the London School of Economics estimate that no-deal Brexit could lead to a 63% decrease in exports to the European Union. For the salmon farmers, for the crofters producing lamb and for the shell fishermen in my constituency, that could be absolutely ruinous. What comfort can the Chancellor of the Duchy give to these people in my constituency whose livelihood depends on that export market?
The Right Honourable Gentleman makes an important point. And one of the things that the government has always stressed is that in the event of a no-deal exit, the sectors that would be most adversely affected by tariffs would be in the agriculture sector. And it hits, in particular, red meat producers particularly hard, which is why we're anxious to avoid that outcome and to secure a deal. Come what may, it will be the case that there will be new processes, but also new markets for producers in Orkney and Shetland. And I'll work with him in order to make sure that whatever eventuality, we support the high-quality producers in his constituency.
Question from Deanna Davidson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend will know that I share his vivacious optimism about Britain's future as an independent sovereign trading nation. But the farmers of Teesdale and Weardale are understandably concerned about what happens if we get to the end of the year without an agreement. So can I ask my right honourable friend just to reassure the House, to reassure my constituents that all is being done by our negotiators to reach that deal? And does he agree with me that actually the future of Britain's trading policy, our independence as a trading nation, will provide great opportunities for our agricultural sector?
Well, my honourable friend, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for attributing to me vivacity as well as optimism. I'm certainly optimistic, but it's those who were elected in the 2019 general election on our benches who provide the vivacity, including herself. But she's absolutely right to raise the concerns of farmers in Teesdale and Weardale, and indeed across the North East. As I mentioned in response to the previous question, those who are red meat producers are those who, in the event of no deal, most need our support. But it's also those who are red meat producers, particularly lamb exporters and sheep farmers, who have a great deal to gain. One of the biggest consumers of lamb and sheep meat in the world is the US. At the moment, our access to the US market is restricted. It is one of many markets, including markets in the Far East and the Middle East, to which we could have access. And my honourable friend's advocacy on behalf of the farming sector and on behalf of free trade shows the way to future prosperity for the constituents that she serves so well.
Thank you. Point of order, Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We were informed yesterday that the Paymaster General calls are set to resume. Now, members will remember that these calls were used earlier this year while the House was not sitting due to the coronavirus pandemic. And many members were very concerned at the lack of opportunity for scrutiny during that period, and that concern is ongoing. I'm still struggling, and I know other members are, to get responsive ministers from many departments, including the Treasury. And I am concerned about what the resumption of these calls implies. I'm sure members from across this House will agree that any resumption of the calls must be in addition to existing scrutiny, rather than as a substitute so that ministers have to come before the House less frequently. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would be grateful if you could offer guidance on how best to seek assurances from the Government that they are committed to parliamentary scrutiny and the resumption of these calls does not herald new limitations on the mechanisms available to members of this House to hold Government to account.
Well done. Thank you very much. I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for making that point of order. It is the case of the Paymaster General, who of course is a Cabinet Office Minister and does an excellent job in keeping members from all parties updated, and has done throughout the difficult time of the coronavirus pandemic, is doing that to augment the scrutiny which quite rightly ministers at this dispatch box will be exposed to, as we all seek to ensure that we do the right thing by all our constituents at this inevitably testing time.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for that point of order. Very glad that the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster was here to respond, and I hope that that will give her some reassurance. Thank you. In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes.